Before we dive into this story, take a deep breath. Because somewhere between ancient wisdom, questionable decisions, and the occasional philosophical crisis disguised as a nap, you might just find yourself laughing at how much the past still looks like us. So grab your tea, silence your inner pharaoh, and let's wander back in time together. Just try not to trip over the irony. Imagine a room lit only by flickering oil lamps. A man lies on a wooden table, his head shaved, his eyes wide open, and his hands gripping the sides as if he's trying to hold on to life itself. Beside him stands a figure dressed in linen, holding a sharp bronze instrument that glints like the blade of judgment. There is no anesthesia, no sterile environment, only the smell of sweat, wine, and fear. Then, without hesitation, the priest-surgeon presses the instrument against the man's skull and begins to carve a circle through bone. It is not murder. It is medicine, or at least what passed for it in the ancient sands of Egypt. The practice was called trepanation. To modern minds, it sounds like something straight out of a nightmare, but for ancient Egyptians, it was a doorway, a literal opening, to release evil spirits believed to cause seizures, headaches, and madness. If someone heard voices, the explanation wasn't psychological imbalance or epilepsy. It was spirits trapped inside the skull, and what better way to free them than by giving them an exit? The Egyptians, after all, were nothing if not practical. The human head was just another temple in need of renovation. Of course, the idea of drilling into someone's skull might make even the bravest viewer clutch their own head right now. But here's the astonishing part. Many of those patients survived. Archaeologists have found skulls with smooth edges around the holes, showing that the bone healed afterward. Some people even lived long enough to have more than one trepanation. Imagine being that unlucky, surviving the first hole in your head only to have your healer say, "Well, the gods must still be whispering. Let's try again." It's easy to laugh now, but there's something deeply human in their logic. Faced with suffering they couldn't explain, they chose to act. We, too, poke and prod our mysteries, just with smaller holes and more expensive tools. Neurosurgeons today drill into skulls for reasons the Egyptians would have understood perfectly: to relieve pressure, remove tumors, or calm the storms of epilepsy. We like to think of them as primitive, but perhaps we've only swapped their incantations for medical jargon. Maybe every generation believes it has tamed the spirits when it has only renamed them. Picture it: a healer in Thebes, 3,000 years before Christ, preparing for a cranial operation. There's no anesthesia, but there is wine, lots of it. Not for the surgeon, though, but for the patient, who is encouraged to drink until he forgets where he is. And when the blade meets bone, the only sound is the rhythmic chanting of prayers meant to distract from the pain. If the patient screams, it's taken as a good sign. The spirits are leaving, and that means the gods are listening. The tools they used were crude by modern standards: sharpened flint, bronze knives, and circular saws that looked more like jewelry than instruments of surgery. Yet they were handled with astonishing precision. Some cuts were so clean that modern surgeons have admitted grudging admiration. They didn't have microscopes or scalpels, but they had steady hands and unwavering faith. Faith, it turns out, is a remarkably effective sedative, at least until the pain sets in. What's fascinating is that the Egyptians didn't see a boundary between body and soul. Illness was not a mechanical failure, it was a cosmic imbalance. A headache could be the whisper of a curse, a fever the shadow of a forgotten sin. So healing wasn't just physical, it was moral, spiritual, and profoundly theatrical. Every operation was part performance, part exorcism. The surgeon was not just a doctor, but an interpreter between the mortal and divine. You can imagine the atmosphere: chanting assistance, incense filling the air, and somewhere in the background, a mother praying that her child would wake up whole. And yet, despite all the mysticism, their methods sometimes worked. The pressure inside a skull caused by trauma or infection could indeed be relieved by a hole, saving the patient's life. They didn't understand the science, but they knew the results. Maybe that's the secret behind all human progress. We stumble upon truth long before we understand it. There's a kind of dark humor in realizing that some of our ancestors' most terrifying practices laid the groundwork for modern medicine. We laugh at them for drilling into skulls, but we now drill into ours, with anesthesia, yes. But the principle remains oddly the same. It makes you wonder which of our current medical miracles will look barbaric a few thousand years from now. Will future generations laugh at our lasers and implants the way we laugh at crocodile dung and bronze scalpels? The thought is both humbling and strangely comforting. And perhaps that's why stories like these grip us. They remind us that humans have always been both genius and fool, saint and madman, healer and destroyer. The same hands that carved hieroglyphs of beauty also carved into bone to chase invisible enemies. The same civilization that built pyramids with mathematical precision believed that migraines were caused by angry ghosts. It's easy to judge them, but maybe we're not so different. Our ghosts just wear lab coats now. As the operation ends, the surgeon lifts his tool, wipes it with linen, and murmurs a prayer to Thoth, the god of wisdom. The patient breathes shallowly. Perhaps he survives, perhaps not. Either way, the ritual is complete. The spirits have been appeased. Somewhere beyond the Nile, the sun sinks into the horizon, and another story of pain, courage, and curiosity disappears into the sand, waiting for us to unearth it again, centuries later. And as we imagine that scene fading into dusk, one question lingers like the echo of a chisel against bone. If this was their idea of healing, what else did they dare to try? The idea of using wine as medicine might sound charming at first, until you realize it wasn't for celebration, but survival. In ancient Egypt, wine was not poured to toast victory or love. It was poured down the throat of a terrified patient about to undergo surgery. There were no syringes, no anesthesia, no gentle countdown before unconsciousness, just fermented grapes, a prayer, and the vague hope that the gods would take pity. The drink dulled the senses enough to make a man forget the knife waiting for him, though not always for long. Pain has a way of cutting through even the finest vintage. The Egyptians understood something profound without quite realizing it. Pain management is half chemistry, half psychology. The wine didn't just numb, it reassured. It was a signal that the gods were near, that the patient wasn't alone in the darkness about to unfold. And there's something oddly modern about that. Today we talk about placebo effects, mind-body connections, and faith in medicine. But they were doing that 4,000 years ago with a cup of red liquid and a few whispered spells. Imagine the scene. The healer, with eyes steady as stone, holds a bronze cup filled with wine. He lifts it toward the patient like a priest offering communion. The patient drinks, coughs, grimaces. Around them, attendants burn incense of myrrh and resin, filling the room with a heavy sweetness meant to mask the scent of fear. Then, as the chants grow louder, the first cut begins. The surgeon works with a calmness that would make modern doctors envious. There are no monitors, no gloves, no sterile masks, just ritual, rhythm, and repetition. And somehow, against all odds, it often worked. Egyptians recorded cases of wound care, bone setting, even amputations that healed cleanly. They had poultices made of honey, one of the world's oldest antibiotics, and knew that wine, thanks to its acidity, could cleanse a wound. When you look at it that way, their methods seem less like madness and more like intuition honed by centuries of trial and error. It makes you wonder how many discoveries in history began not with reason, but with desperation. Still, some of their medical recipes were enough to make the bravest man reconsider the definition of treatment. Take, for example, their use of crocodile dung. Yes, you heard that right. Crocodile feces. They dried it, ground it, and mixed it with honey or milk to create ointments and, believe it or not, contraceptives. The logic was as bizarre as it was sincere. Crocodiles were powerful, feared creatures. Their waste, therefore, must hold protective power. It's the kind of thinking that makes sense only in a world where everything sacred and disgusting could coexist in the same bowl. It's easy to laugh, but then again, the line between medicine and madness has always been thin. Modern pharmaceutical ads sound just as absurd if you remove the branding. Take this pill to improve your mood, but it may cause nausea, confusion, or sudden death. Suddenly, a bit of crocodile dung doesn't sound so far-fetched. Humans, ancient or modern, will swallow anything if you promise them relief. In the Egyptian worldview, every material carried symbolic weight. Honey meant purification, wine meant divinity, feces meant power over decay. A remedy wasn't just chemistry, it was poetry in physical form. To them, the body was a microcosm of the universe. Healing it meant restoring cosmic order. If your body hurt, something in the balance of the cosmos was off kilter. A wound on your arm might be linked to a quarrel between gods. Fixing it was not just a medical duty, it was an act of worship, and the doctors knew their audience. Many treatments were as theatrical as they were therapeutic. A physician might recite verses to the god Thoth while applying a poultice, or whisper the name of Isis as he sewed a wound. To the patient, the experience felt divine, as though healing were descending from the heavens themselves. It's hard not to envy that level of drama. Modern hospitals, with their cold lights and beeping machines, lack the incense, the chanting, the sense that something sacred is happening. Maybe that's why so many people still turn to alternative medicine. Deep down, we don't just want to be cured. We want to feel that the universe cares we're in pain. The Egyptians' strange ingredients weren't always random either. Modern studies have shown that some of their bizarre prescriptions had real pharmacological effects. Moldy bread, for instance, was used to treat infected wounds. And yes, that's basically an ancient form of penicillin. They also used copper compounds with antimicrobial properties long before the term bacteria was invented. They may not have understood the why, but they mastered the how. It's as if the gods themselves whispered science disguised as superstition. What's most fascinating is that these ancient healers saw no distinction between medicine and magic, because for them, both were simply tools to fight chaos. When a patient survived, it wasn't just skill, it was proof that order had triumphed over disorder. They didn't measure success in recovery rates, but in the restoration of harmony. And maybe that's a better metric than we'd like to admit. After all, healing is more than mending tissue. It's finding peace in the knowledge that pain won't last forever. If you think about it, there's something strangely comforting about their approach. Even their failures carried purpose. When a treatment didn't work, it wasn't because the medicine was wrong, it was because the gods had another plan. That belief softened the blow of tragedy. Today, when medicine fails, we blame the system, the doctor, or ourselves. The Egyptians blamed the cosmos, and somehow that made the pain more bearable. Maybe ignorance has its own kind of mercy. Picture again that small room by the Nile. The patient lies there, bleeding, trembling, whispering a prayer. The doctor presses a bandage soaked in wine and honey over the wound. Outside, the river flows endlessly, carrying the scent of life and decay. The stars begin to rise, and for a brief moment, everyone in that room believes they've touched eternity. The patient may live, or he may die, but the act itself, the attempt to heal, is what mattered. Because in a world ruled by gods, to fight suffering was to defy fate itself. And if that defiance required drilling skulls, drinking wine, or smearing crocodile dung in the name of hope, then so be it. After all, who among us hasn't done something questionable in the pursuit of feeling better? There's something almost poetic about a civilization that looked at pain and decided the solution must involve mixing crocodile excrement with honey and saying a prayer. It's the kind of confidence only a people who built pyramids could have, utterly convinced that if they could align monuments with the stars, they could probably align the human body with divine order. And perhaps they weren't entirely wrong. Beneath all that strangeness was a deep understanding that life was fragile, mysterious, and worth fighting for. Even if the methods bordered on the insane, they had an explanation for everything, and every ache carried meaning. A stomach pain might be the work of an angry spirit, a swollen leg the result of divine punishment. There were no accidents, only messages. Their doctors, who were often priests, spent as much time decoding omens as studying wounds. You might visit one complaining of chest pain and leave with a jar of ointment and a stern warning that you'd angered a god. In a way, that kind of diagnosis still exists. Only now it comes from Google. It's remarkable how methodical they were, though. For all their reliance on faith, their approach to surgery showed precision and record-keeping that bordered on scientific. They documented symptoms, treatments, and outcomes on papyri that still survive today. One of them, known as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, reads like the world's first surgical manual. It's shockingly rational. No spells, no appeals to gods, just careful observation and notes on prognosis. The text even recommends leaving hopeless cases alone, advising an ailment not to be treated, which, translated into modern language, basically means you're doomed, but at least we tried. That manual also includes descriptions of fractures, brain injuries, and even spinal trauma. Imagine the courage or madness of trying to treat those injuries with nothing but bronze knives, honey, and optimism. Yet somehow they managed. They stabilized broken bones with splints, cleaned wounds with alcohol, and even stitched flesh with linen thread. Their sutures were rough, but they worked. You can almost picture an Egyptian healer squinting in the dim light, carefully threading a needle made of bone, whispering to himself, "If this works, I'll write it down." And while their tools were primitive, they were undeniably beautiful. Archaeologists have found entire sets of surgical instruments buried with physicians, forceps, scalpels, probes, all made of copper and bronze, some inlaid with gold. The handles were carved with care, not for aesthetics alone, but for reverence. Each cut, each stitch was a sacred act. In a strange way, the elegance of the instruments told a story. Healing wasn't just a job, it was a covenant with the gods. What's almost funny is how similar their mindset was to ours, even after thousands of years. They wanted control over chaos. We dress our fear in white lab coats. They dressed theirs in linen and gold. When they didn't understand something, they invented stories about spirits and curses. When we don't understand something, we invent acronyms and clinical jargon. Either way, it's just a fancy way to say, we have no idea, but we're working on it. And let's not forget their obsession with cleanliness. It's easy to assume ancient people were filthy, but the Egyptians were borderline fanatical about hygiene. They bathed daily, shaved their entire bodies to prevent lice, and even wore perfumes made from lotus and frankincense to ward off disease. Surgeons would wash before and after operations, not because of germ theory, but because cleanliness was considered divine. Maybe they didn't know about bacteria, but they knew that filth invited chaos, and chaos was the enemy. It's strangely comforting to think that 3,000 years ago, someone was scrubbing their hands before touching a wound, guided not by science, but by sacred instinct. Their operating spaces, however, were far from what we'd call sterile. A surgery room might be a small chamber in a temple where incense mingled with the smell of iron and blood. The patient would lie on a slab of stone, attendants chanting prayers to distract from the horror about to unfold. The surgeon's eyes, steady but tired, would focus not just on flesh, but on fate. Every incision was both medical and moral, a chance to prove devotion, to restore order, to please unseen powers. It was part hospital, part altar. And then there's the matter of pain. Without anesthesia, every procedure became a test of endurance. The screams weren't a sign of suffering. They were proof that the patient was still alive, still fighting. The healer might whisper reassurances or simply tighten his grip and continue. Sometimes the patient fainted, sometimes he didn't. Either way, the act had to be completed, because hesitation would anger the gods. When you think about it, that's the essence of faith, to believe that agony has meaning. But perhaps the strangest irony of all is that many of these early surgeries actually succeeded. Evidence shows healed bones, cleanly trepanned skulls, and wounds that closed neatly. Against every logical prediction, their patients lived. Maybe it was luck, maybe it was divine mercy, or maybe the Egyptians had discovered something we've forgotten, that belief itself can be medicine. When you think you might die but trust that the healer standing over you is guided by the gods, the body somehow cooperates. Fear gives way to surrender, and in that surrender, healing begins. And still, amid all this, one can't help but laugh at the sheer audacity of it all. Imagine telling someone today that you plan to cure their headache by drilling a hole in their head, washing it with wine, and sealing it with honey. You'd be arrested within the hour. But in ancient Egypt, you'd be celebrated as a servant of the divine. It's both terrifying and admirable. The unshakable belief that even the impossible could be managed with a steady hand and a strong prayer. As centuries passed, their knowledge spread beyond their borders. Greek physicians studied Egyptian methods and built upon them. And through Greece came Rome, and through Rome, us. Every time a modern surgeon makes an incision, a ghost of Egypt's healers stands beside them. The tools have changed, the rituals have faded, but the essence remains. A human being, fragile and afraid, trusting another to open their body in the hope of relief. There's something eternal about that image. A flickering light, a trembling hand, a whispered plea for mercy. And as the centuries flowed like the Nile itself, carrying their wisdom downstream, new rituals replaced the old. But somewhere in the rhythm of the scalpel, the heartbeat of that ancient faith still echoes. Because deep down, whether through magic or medicine, every act of healing begins the same way, with someone brave enough to believe that life, despite its pain, is still worth saving. The air inside the temple was thick with the scent of burning resins and sweat, the kind of mix that clings to the skin and memory alike. In that humid half-darkness, where shadows danced like nervous spirits, a healer prepared his instruments, bronze blades laid in a neat row, each polished until it shimmered in the lamplight. Every movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. He wasn't merely treating a patient. He was stepping into a conversation with the gods. The Egyptians believed that illness was never random. It was a disturbance in cosmic balance. And to restore that balance, one needed both skill and reverence. The surgeon prayed not just for steady hands, but for moral clarity, because in his mind, slicing flesh without divine permission was as dangerous as offending the pharaoh himself. It's hard not to imagine the tension of that moment. The patient, usually a worker or soldier, was stripped down to the waist, the wound exposed, trembling from fear more than pain. He knew the healer could as easily be his savior as his executioner. There were no guarantees. The chants rising in the background weren't just for the gods, they were for courage, for the patients, the healers, and maybe for the gods too, since everyone seemed equally terrified of failure. The silence before the first cut was thick enough to stop time. And then the knife met skin, releasing not only blood but faith, desperation, and perhaps a little madness. It's a strange thing, really, how much theater there was in ancient medicine. Every act had to look purposeful, divine, guided by unseen forces. Today, a doctor's white coat serves the same function. It signals authority, it calms nerves, it says, "Trust me, I know what I'm doing." The Egyptian equivalent was linen robes and the scent of incense. Humanity hasn't changed much. We still dress our healers like prophets. Maybe we need to. Maybe we can't bear the idea that the person holding the scalpel is just as scared as we are. There were moments when these rituals turned astonishingly practical. The Egyptians developed early forms of surgery that seem almost impossible for their time: dental extractions, cauterization of wounds, even setting broken bones with splints and bandages soaked in resin. They treated abscesses by lancing them and drained fluid from swollen limbs using reed tubes. The precision with which they documented such procedures would make any modern medical student nod in appreciation. Some of those same principles, clean incisions, compression, immobilization, are still taught today, only now they're explained with Latin instead of hieroglyphs, and they weren't afraid to innovate in ways that border on absurd brilliance. For example, they used raw meat as an early form of wound dressing, believing it could draw out evil spirits. Technically, it did help stop bleeding, though one can only imagine the smell after a few hours under the Egyptian sun. Perhaps that's why they later switched to honey. It was cleaner, smelled nicer, and had actual antibacterial properties. There's something charming about that learning curve, from steak to sugar. You can almost hear an ancient doctor saying, "Well, that didn't work, let's try dessert." But humor aside, their experiments reveal something profound, curiosity stronger than fear. They dissected animals to understand anatomy, observed the effects of injuries in battle, and recorded every discovery in detailed scrolls. They didn't always know why something worked, but they were relentless in noting that it did. It's the foundation of science itself. pattern before explanation. In a sense, they were performing the world's longest trial and error experiment, and humanity has been peer reviewing it ever since. Still, no matter how advanced their knowledge became, it always carried a shadow of mysticism. Before surgery, the healer might whisper a spell to ward off Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of plagues, whose wrath could turn a small infection into death. Afterward, he'd burn incense and offer milk to the gods, asking forgiveness for cutting into one of their creations. It's easy to dismiss this as superstition, but maybe there was wisdom in it. The ceremony reminded everyone, doctor and patient alike, that life was fragile, sacred, not entirely in human hands. Modern medicine sometimes forgets that humility. We've replaced prayers with prescriptions, but the uncertainty remains. Some of the most intriguing operations were performed not on the sick, but on the dead. The art of mummification required a level of anatomical understanding that bordered on surgical genius. Removing the brain through the nose using a hooked instrument sounds like horror, but it was done with startling precision. The embalmers knew how to preserve organs, how to dry the body without destroying it, how to turn flesh into eternity. And while they claimed this process was purely spiritual, it doubled as a dissection class for future healers. Death became the best teacher of life. There's something both macabre and poetic about that, learning how to heal by studying decay. Their fascination with the human body extended to its smallest details. Some papyri describe conditions we now recognize as diabetes, heart disease, and arthritis. They even noticed that diet played a role in illness, recommending honey and herbs for balance and warning against excessive bread and beer. Advice that still holds up, though we prefer to hear it from influencers instead of priests. Perhaps the funniest part is that while we've invented smartphones and space travel, we still haven't evolved past ignoring good medical advice until it hurts. The Egyptians, at least, blamed their disobedience on angry gods. We just call it being busy. There's also evidence that women played important roles in this medical tapestry. Female physicians, often trained within temple schools, specialized in childbirth and gynecological care. Some texts even describe early contraceptives made from plant extracts and minerals. Their understanding of fertility and anatomy was extraordinary for its time. And yet, they too cloaked their methods in the language of divinity, blessing the wombs they treated, invoking Isis for protection. Healing for them was never mechanical. It was sacred choreography between flesh and faith. Even pain itself had spiritual meaning. Enduring it was seen as proof of inner strength, a kind of offering to the gods. Patients were praised for bravery rather than pitied for suffering. In that sense, every operation was a moral test. Today we sedate pain instantly, but there's a strange dignity in their approach, the belief that pain could purify, that enduring it might grant cosmic favor. It's hard to say if that made them tougher or simply more resigned to suffering, but it gave every incision a kind of purpose. And through all of this, the chanting, the cutting, the prayers, the wine, the honey, the blood, what emerges is a portrait of a civilization that refused to surrender to helplessness. They didn't wait for miracles, they made them with their own trembling hands. Theirs was a medicine of courage, intuition, and hope, stitched together with superstition. Perhaps that's the most human form of healing there is. Even now, beneath our science and technology, we're still whispering into the dark, still trusting that somewhere between skill and faith lies the fragile miracle of survival. The lamps burn lower, the healer wipes his tools, and the patient breathes shallowly under linen bandages. Outside, the desert wind howls softly, carrying the scent of myrrh and mortality. The healer looks toward the stars, where the gods are said to dwell, and for a fleeting moment, he believes they are watching. Maybe they are. Or maybe the only divine thing in that room was the courage it took to keep believing that a trembling human hand could hold back the endless tide of death, even for a single night. Under the scorching Egyptian sun, the Nile shimmered like a silver ribbon cutting through eternity. Its waters carried life, disease, and the endless faith of a civilization obsessed with the boundary between living and dying. Along its banks, healers still prepared their instruments, much as their ancestors had for centuries, sharpening bronze blades and whispering ancient invocations. Medicine in Egypt was not an evolution, it was a memory, passed down from one generation to another, each more confident that they were touching the very will of the gods. And in a way, they were right. Because to look at their world is to see people who believed that healing wasn't just a duty, but a form of defiance against mortality itself. They saw disease not as an accident, but as a message. If your heart failed, it was because your emotions had offended Mayat, the goddess of balance. If your skin broke into boils, you had disturbed harmony in your household or angered a spirit wandering the desert. So to heal a person meant restoring the universe around them. A doctor wasn't merely fixing a body, he was rewriting fate. It makes you wonder if that's why so many of their treatments sounded more like poetry than prescriptions. Honey for purity, wine for courage, crocodile dung for protection. An odd recipe, but in its own logic, a perfectly balanced meal of symbolism. The rituals of healing were performed with such devotion that it's hard not to admire their conviction. The Temple of Kamambo, for instance, wasn't just a place of worship. It was a medical school, a hospital, and a laboratory combined. In its walls, carved hieroglyphs depicted surgical instruments, scalpels, forceps, spoons, and hooks, all designed centuries before the concept of sterilization existed. The priests who worked there treated soldiers, farmers, and nobles alike. They prayed before every procedure, believing that failure to do so might invite a curse. Imagine a modern surgeon pausing mid-operation to say, "Hold on, let me just check with Horus first." You'd laugh, but maybe a few prayers in hospitals wouldn't hurt. What's both eerie and inspiring is that these healers operated on trust alone. They didn't have microscopes or thermometers. They had observation, intuition, and courage. They knew how to reset a dislocated jaw by wrapping cloth around it and twisting gently, and how to treat burns with milk and resin. Their anatomy lessons came from accident and necessity. Soldiers wounded in battle, bodies being embalmed, the occasional volunteer who didn't survive the cure. They studied with their hands, not with books. And while that sounds barbaric, there's something almost enviable about that raw intimacy with life and death. And yet, for all their reverence, they were pragmatic too. They recorded every detail, every treatment, and every failure. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts ever found, contains hundreds of remedies and surgical instructions. Some were brilliant, like using honey as an antiseptic. Others were downright questionable, like grinding lizard parts and pigeon droppings into a paste for skin infections. Still, behind the absurdity lies a kind of wisdom. When you don't know which ingredient will save a life, you try everything. It's a philosophy that built both medicine and modern science. Curiosity first, explanation later. Their understanding of the human body was astonishing for its time. They could describe pulse points, diagnose heart disease, and even detect pregnancy by watering barley seeds with a woman's urine, a test that, surprisingly, modern scientists have confirmed can sometimes work. You can almost picture an Egyptian doctor nodding smugly across 4 millennia saying, "Told you so." Ardut. The human desire to be right clearly transcends time and culture. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of their practice was how closely medicine and death coexisted. The same precision used to heal was also used to embalm. The surgeon who stitched wounds by day might remove organs by night. To prepare a body for eternity, one had to understand it completely, every vein, every tendon, every fragile bridge between matter and spirit. They believed that preserving the body was the final form of healing, a way to ensure that death didn't win. The irony is poetic. Their greatest medical achievements were practiced on corpses. And what a process that was. The removal of the brain through the nose, once seen as a grotesque ritual, was done with such finesse that modern pathologists still marvel at it. The embalmers used resins, natron salts, and oils that preserved tissue for thousands of years, proof that their science, mystical as it was, worked. In a sense, mummification was their ultimate surgery, one meant not to save life, but to immortalize it. It's oddly fitting that we've learned so much about their medicine because of those who didn't survive it. Death became their teacher, and the dead became their greatest textbooks. Still, it's the living that truly reveal who they were. The Egyptians were obsessed with maintaining balance in everything, from the stars above to the organs within. They believed the heart was the center of thought and emotion, not the brain, and that, after death, it would be weighed against a feather to determine one's fate. So, every treatment, every incision, every whispered prayer carried moral weight. A good doctor wasn't just a skilled hand, he was a righteous soul. And maybe there's a lesson there for us, that medicine without conscience is just mechanics, and healing without empathy is just repair. It's easy to laugh at their more bizarre remedies, but there's something deeply human in their mistakes. We, too, look for miracles in pills, diets, and detoxes. We, too, cling to the illusion that if we just find the right mixture of ingredients, scientific or spiritual, we can escape the inevitable. The Egyptians, at least, were honest about their fear. They didn't hide death behind sterile curtains. They looked it in the eye and said, "Not today." That kind of bravery deserves respect, even if it came wrapped in crocodile dung and divine chants. Their legacy lingers quietly in the way we think about medicine. The oath modern doctors take, to do no harm, echoes the same reverence for balance they once preached. The symbol of healing, the caduceus, with its entwined serpents, descends from Egyptian imagery. Even our hospitals, with their long corridors and hushed reverence, feel faintly like temples, places where faith and science still hold hands in uneasy truce. Maybe that's why the story of their medicine fascinates us so deeply. It's not just about scalpels or spells, it's about the endless human struggle to make meaning out of suffering. And as the Nile continues to flow, carrying the dust of their civilization toward the sea, their wisdom endures, not in their gods, but in their persistence. Every time we choose to fight disease instead of surrendering, every time we heal without understanding why it works, we're repeating their faith. They believed that the human body was divine architecture, that to mend it was to honor creation itself. Perhaps they were right. After all, there's something sacred in every act of healing, whether it's a whisper in a temple, a surgeon's scalpel, or simply the will to keep going when the world seems determined to end. And maybe, as the stars rise over the same desert they once gazed upon, the spirits of those ancient healers still smile, knowing that their legacy survived not in monuments or mummies, but in something far greater. The stubborn, beautiful belief that no matter how fragile we are, we can still push back against the darkness, one trembling hand at a time. Night in ancient Egypt was not silent. The Nile murmured in the distance, frogs sang in the reeds, and somewhere inside a mud brick house, a healer leaned over a small flame, preparing a remedy that smelled like both salvation and madness. He crushed herbs, mixed honey, whispered a prayer, and stirred in a handful of powdered minerals that shimmered under the lamplight. His patient lay on a mat, half conscious, muttering the name of a god. The healer, unfazed, looked up toward the ceiling and muttered, "If this doesn't work, it's your will, not mine." That blend of faith, science, and resignation was the foundation of Egyptian medicine, and in some ways still is. They were masters of improvisation. The same mind that designed pyramids also decided that goat fat mixed with ground lotus petals could soothe a burn. The same civilization that aligned temples with the stars also thought pigeon droppings might stop infections. There's a fine line between genius and insanity, and the Egyptians walked it barefoot. But behind the absurdity lay a strange consistency. They believed the world was held together by balance, and everything, every herb, every chant, every drop of wine, was part of that cosmic equilibrium. You didn't just heal a wound. You restored harmony between flesh, spirit, and the gods. And yet, for all their mysticism, they had an uncanny grasp of anatomy. They knew that blood circulated through the body, that the heart was the command center of life, and that the pulse could reveal a person's state of health. Their physicians would place fingers on the wrist, feeling for rhythms that spoke more loudly than words. They didn't have stethoscopes, but they had intuition. And in some ways, intuition is just another kind of instrument, one that modern medicine has largely forgotten. Imagine a doctor today saying, "I can feel your soul and your pulse." He'd probably lose his license, but 4,000 years ago, that was cutting-edge science. Their understanding of disease came from careful observation, not divine guesses. They noted that wounds treated with honey healed faster, that moldy bread prevented infections, and that urine could reveal internal disorders. They studied color, smell, and even taste. Yes, taste, to diagnose conditions. If you think your doctor's job is stressful, imagine having to lick your patient's discharge to determine if it's sweet or bitter. The Egyptians had courage, or at least strong stomachs. Still, there was method in their madness. Every sense was a diagnostic tool. To them, the body spoke a language, and the physician's job was to listen. That's what makes their medicine so fascinating. It wasn't cold or mechanical. It was deeply human, rooted in empathy. Healing wasn't something done to you. It was something done with you. The physician was a companion on your journey through pain, not a distant authority figure. He sat beside you, prayed with you, drank with you, sometimes even cried with you. Maybe that's why patients trusted them so blindly. Because they didn't just treat symptoms, they treated fear. And fear, as every healer since has learned, is the hardest disease to cure. Some of their treatments, surprisingly, still make sense. They used castor oil as a laxative, cumin for digestion, and willow bark for pain, the same active compound that would later become aspirin. Their pharmacies were temples filled with jars labeled in hieroglyphs that only the initiated could read. It was a kind of sacred pharmacy, where each ingredient had both chemical and spiritual weight. A prescription might include equal parts herbs and prayers, because the mind and body were seen as inseparable. Even the act of swallowing a potion was symbolic. It meant letting the divine enter you. Today, we swallow vitamins for the same reason, though we call it self-care. Of course, there were moments when the line between healing and horror blurred. In some cases, the cure was worse than the disease. A toothache might be treated by burning herbs near the cheek until the nerves numbed, a crude but effective form of anesthesia. They cauterized wounds with hot metal, drained abscesses with reeds, and stitched gashes using thread made from animal sinew. Some survived. Others became offerings to the gods of health, whether they wanted to or not. Yet, through pain and loss, they kept learning. Each failed cure became a lesson carved into the long memory of civilization. And what's both terrifying and beautiful is how much they were willing to risk for knowledge. Imagine being that first surgeon to perform a cranial incision, to cut open a chest, to remove a tumor with nothing but bronze and faith, no applause, no scientific journals, just the weight of responsibility and a patient whose life balanced on a blade. They may not have understood the body in molecular detail, but they understood courage. And maybe that's what medicine really is, a constant gamble against the unknown, where compassion is the only thing separating healing from harm. Even their superstitions had unexpected logic. When they recited spells before operations, it wasn't just ritual, it was rhythm. The chanting helped steady the hands, calm the mind, and synchronize breath between healer and patient. Today we call it mindfulness. Back then they called it devotion. They might not have had sedatives, but they knew that calmness could dull pain, and that belief itself could mend what medicine couldn't reach. In that sense, every prayer was anesthesia for the soul. And yet, their medicine wasn't confined to temples or palaces. Traveling healers roamed the villages, carrying small pouches of herbs and scrolls of wisdom. They treated farmers, fishermen, slaves, anyone who could offer a coin or a chicken in return. Some were charlatans, selling hope in bottles. Others were geniuses lost to history, nameless figures who might have discovered antiseptics before the word existed. They practiced under the stars, trusting the same constellations that guided the pharaohs. It's a humbling reminder that science, too, began on the dirt floor of human need. Perhaps the greatest irony is that much of what they created was preserved because of their obsession with death. Their tombs became time capsules, their medical scrolls hidden beside mummies as if healing knowledge itself needed to be reborn in the afterlife. Thousands of years later, when archaeologists unrolled those papyri, they found not fantasy but formula, proof that curiosity is humanity's oldest religion. The Egyptians had no need to separate medicine from faith because, to them, both were simply forms of worship, one of the gods, the other of life itself. And so, as the centuries passed and their empire turned to dust, their wisdom flowed like the Nile, quietly, persistently, shaping everything it touched. The Greeks borrowed it, the Romans copied it, and the modern world inherited it without realizing. Every time a doctor takes a pulse, every time a nurse uses honey to treat a burn, a fragment of that ancient knowledge breathes again. It's almost poetic that the people who built monuments to eternity ended up achieving it not with stone, but with science. There's a certain comfort in that. Because beneath all the mystery, all the superstition and strange remedies, what truly defined Egyptian medicine was hope. The stubborn, radiant hope that life could be extended, that suffering could be eased, that death could be delayed just one more day. And in that timeless struggle across every generation, every civilization, every sterile hospital and dusty temple, one truth remains unchanged. We are all still trying to do exactly what they did, hold on to the fragile miracle of being alive, even as the darkness gathers at the edge of the flame. The desert wind carried stories in its breath, stories of healers who stitched flesh with linen, who whispered to the gods as they drained pus from a wound, who looked at pain not as an enemy but as a teacher. Somewhere in that world of blazing suns and endless sand, medicine was not simply an act of healing. It was an act of faith, of rebellion, of daring to touch what mortals were not meant to touch. Imagine standing in that world where disease was a divine puzzle and every cure felt like trespassing in sacred territory. The Egyptian healer was part surgeon, part priest, part philosopher, and part gambler, because every time he lifted a blade, he wagered not only with flesh, but with fate itself. They believed the heart was the throne of consciousness, the center of thought, emotion, and morality. The brain, ironically, was considered more of a cooling system, a biological fan to prevent the body from overheating under the relentless Egyptian sun. When embalmers removed it during mummification, they didn't preserve it. They tossed it away like useless clay. And yet the heart was sacred, kept carefully inside the body, for it would be weighed in the afterlife against the feather of truth. You could live with missing organs, they thought, but not with a heavy heart. Perhaps they weren't so wrong. Today we still talk about heartbreak, but rarely about brain break. This obsession with the heart shaped their medicine. A physician would study the rhythm of a pulse like a musician studies melody. A weak beat meant imbalance. An erratic one meant chaos within the body. They even mapped invisible channels that carried life force, what they called metu, throughout the body, much like the way we now describe veins and arteries. It's remarkable to think that a civilization from 3000 BC was already describing circulation, centuries before Europe would even imagine it. Though they might have explained it as energy from the gods, the observation was precise, almost scientific. Sometimes superstition and science share a handshake, they just don't realize it. They viewed illness as a rupture in the divine harmony of existence. When someone grew sick, the healer's task was to restore cosmic balance, not just health. A cure wasn't about the symptom, it was about the story behind it. If your leg was swollen, it wasn't because of an infection. It was because your soul had stumbled. The treatment might involve poultices, yes, but also confession, prayer, and maybe a symbolic offering to soothe whichever spirit you'd offended. Modern psychologists would call that holistic therapy. Egyptians would call it Tuesday. Their medicine was also startlingly social. Healing was a shared responsibility, not a solitary act. Families cared for the sick at home, neighbors offered herbs or charms, and healers moved through communities like traveling guardians of equilibrium. It wasn't unusual to see a line of villagers waiting outside a temple, holding small offerings, bread, fruit, or beer, for the physician-priest inside. Healing wasn't a transaction, it was participation in a sacred process. And perhaps that's what made it work. People believed in it so completely that belief itself became part of the cure. There's something undeniably powerful about that kind of faith. Today, we separate body from soul, doctor from patient, faith from fact. But in ancient Egypt, they lived in a seamless web where everything was connected. You could pray to a god while bleeding, and both actions were considered equally logical. Their approach might sound naive, yet somehow it feels wiser than our sterile certainty. After all, a placebo only works if you believe. and belief was their entire operating system. Even childbirth, one of the most dangerous events in ancient life, was transformed into a sacred ritual. Women gave birth squatting on bricks engraved with protective symbols of Hathor, goddess of motherhood. Incantations were sung rhythmically to ease pain, and amulets shaped like frogs and ankhs were placed nearby to invoke fertility and protection. The midwives weren't just attendants, they were conduits of divine will. They used herbs to induce labor, oils to soothe, and words to calm. Imagine giving birth surrounded by women chanting prayers to a cow-headed goddess. It sounds strange, but also oddly comforting. At least someone was rooting for you other than gravity. They even had early forms of gynecological and obstetric texts. The Kahun Papyrus describes contraceptives made of acacia gum and honey, both of which modern science recognizes as mildly spermicidal. So, yes, ancient Egyptians invented birth control thousands of years before modern chemistry, proving once again that desperation is the mother of innovation. The difference is they packaged it with a prayer and a promise to the gods, something pharmaceutical companies have yet to try. But not all medicine was so graceful. Some healers were feared as much as they were respected. Their knowledge of poisons, curses, and spells blurred the line between healing and witchcraft. A physician could be both savior and executioner. Some were even buried with their tongues removed to ensure they couldn't whisper forbidden secrets in the afterlife. You have to admire the logic. If you can't trust someone in life, might as well silence them for eternity. It's a level of HR discipline that would terrify modern hospitals. Even the act of writing about medicine was sacred. Every papyrus began with invocations to Thoth, the god of wisdom, asking for clarity of mind. They believed words themselves had power, that to write a cure was to create it. Perhaps that's why so much of their medicine survived, because it wasn't just knowledge on paper, it was faith made tangible. Every symbol carved into stone, every scroll buried beside a mummy was a plea to future generations. Remember what we learned so our mistakes don't die with us. And remarkably, we listened. Modern archaeology has uncovered enough evidence to show that their treatments often worked. Honey has antimicrobial properties. Willow bark reduces fever. Copper kills bacteria. They may have wrapped it all in magic and mythology, but the results were tangible. The paradox of Egyptian medicine is that it was both wildly spiritual and scientifically effective. They believed the gods guided their hands, but those hands were steady, observant, and curious enough to discover truths that would outlive their temples. It's easy to think of them as primitive, but the more we study them, the more we realize how modern they were. They documented case studies, performed autopsies, and specialized their practice. There were eye doctors, dentists, and even proctologists. Yes, ancient Egypt had the world's first proctologist, complete with papyri describing the treatment of hemorrhoids with honey and herbs. It's humbling to realize that some aspects of human misery are eternal. Civilizations rise and fall, but the discomfort of sitting down after a long day remains universal, and perhaps that's the real gift of studying their medicine. It reminds us that the human condition has always been the same. Fear, pain, love, and hope don't change, only the tools we use to manage them. The Egyptians looked at suffering and refused to accept it as punishment. They saw it as a challenge to overcome. Their surgeries may have been crude, their prayers desperate, but their determination was flawless. They believed in healing because they believed in life. When you imagine the healer finally setting down his bronze scalpel, wiping his hands on linen and looking at the horizon turning gold over the Nile, there's something eternal in that moment. The river flows, the patient breathes, and the healer exhales in relief, whispering a prayer of gratitude to the gods, or maybe to himself, for another small victory against the inevitable. Thousands of years later, under brighter lights and sharper instruments, doctors still do the same. The setting has changed. The gods have different names, but the faith is identical. Somewhere in that quiet exchange between life and death, a small echo remains, the heartbeat of ancient Egypt, still pulsing softly in the veins of modern medicine. Night in Egypt was never fully dark. Even under the weight of silence, the stars shone with an authority that felt almost sentient, as if the heavens themselves were taking notes on everything happening below. Somewhere near the Nile, a healer prepared his patient by lamplight. The man's skin gleamed with oil, his body trembling not from cold, but from what he knew was coming. Pain wasn't just expected, it was part of the ritual. To be healed meant to face agony head-on. And in a culture that saw the human body as both temple and battlefield, surgery was a sacred war. The healer's hands, stained with wine and honey, moved with a rhythm that bordered on prayer. Every motion carried both skill and superstition. He muttered words to Thoth for precision, to Sekhmet for courage, to Anubis for mercy, because in Egypt, you prayed not only for recovery, but also for the surgeon's aim. There was no anesthesia, no sterilization, only the trust that the gods were watching and hopefully in a good mood. Yet somehow, in this precarious dance between faith and fear, they saved lives. It's easy to dismiss their medicine as primitive, but to do so is to underestimate the sophistication hiding behind ritual. They had formulas for treating cataracts, recipes for reducing fever, and ointments that soothed burns. They recognized infections, cleaned wounds, and even used honey as an antiseptic centuries before modern science rediscovered its antibacterial magic. The Egyptians, in their quiet genius, were already playing with chemistry, though they called it alchemy. The line between magic and medicine was thin, perhaps imaginary, but it worked. And that was all that mattered. Still, their obsession with the afterlife meant that death never left the room. Every healer was also, in a way, a student of embalming. The body was a map of eternity, and every organ a clue to understanding divine design. They didn't see the body as disposable. It was sacred, a vessel that had to be treated with respect, even when it failed. In that paradox of reverence and dissection, Egyptian medicine evolved. A priest might remove a heart one day to weigh it in a spiritual ceremony, and the next, he'd be repairing a farmer's broken arm with splints and linen. Death and healing were never enemies. They were colleagues working different shifts. The embalmer's workshop was both morgue and classroom. Here, the art of preservation became the science of anatomy. With each incision into the flesh of the dead, a new understanding of the living emerged. They learned where veins branched, where organs nestled, how muscles layered like woven fabric. They didn't call it biology, but it was. Their curiosity was relentless. Imagine the courage it took to explore the body when every cut risked angering the divine. Modern doctors might fear malpractice suits. Ancient ones feared eternal damnation. Yet both, oddly enough, share the same prayer before a procedure. Please, let this work. The irony is that their search for immortality through mummification gifted immortality to their knowledge. Thousands of years later, when archaeologists cracked open tombs, they didn't just find gold, they found instruction manuals. Papyrus scrolls filled with notes on diseases, symptoms, and cures. Lists of herbs with their temperaments: cooling, warming, soothing, stimulating. Even measurements, precise and careful. Some scrolls read less like prayers and more like clinical charts, proof that observation and logic were quietly blooming beneath the canopy of myth. It's comforting to realize that even in an age of gods and pharaohs, someone was taking notes like an intern. Among their strangest discoveries was the connection between emotion and illness. They believed the heart could be weighed down by grief, that anger could poison the blood, that envy could manifest as physical pain. Thousands of years before Freud, the Egyptians had already diagnosed psychosomatic disorder. The difference was, instead of therapy, they offered purification rituals, music, and incense. Perhaps they were onto something. After all, modern science still can't cure a broken heart. But a little music and good smells never hurt. And then there was laughter, their most underrated medicine. Though rarely recorded, evidence suggests humor was part of their healing process. Tomb paintings show banquets filled with jesters and dancers, even in funerary contexts, because to them, laughter wasn't disrespectful to death. It was defiance. It was saying, you can take my body, but you can't take my joy. One can almost imagine an ancient healer cracking a dry joke as he stitched a wound, hoping the patient's laughter would keep him conscious. In that moment, medicine became theater, and survival became applause. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Egyptian medicine was its humility before mystery. They accepted that not every illness could be cured, not every prayer answered. When a patient died, it wasn't seen as failure, it was the gods reclaiming what was always theirs. This belief spared the healer from despair and gave the patient dignity in death. Maybe that's what modern medicine, for all its brilliance, sometimes forgets. That compassion is not measured by success rates, but by the grace of how we accompany someone to the threshold. The Egyptians didn't fight death. They negotiated with it, and in those negotiations they found meaning. The deeper one looks, the more one sees that their medicine was a mirror of their philosophy. The same society that built pyramids aligned to the stars built its healing practices around balance and order. Maat, the goddess of cosmic harmony, was the unseen supervisor of every operation. Her principle demanded that everything, from the universe to a single cut of a blade, remain in proportion. And so, healing became an art of equilibrium, between life and death, spirit and body, faith and reason. It's hard not to envy that clarity. They didn't waste time debating whether science and spirituality could coexist. They just lived as if they were one. Modern medicine often prides itself on progress, but maybe what the Egyptians had was something more valuable: context. They saw healing as part of a story, not an isolated act. The patient's suffering wasn't just a malfunction, it was a message. To heal was to interpret it. That approach, though ancient, feels strangely ahead of its time. We've replaced their gods with molecules and their temples with hospitals, but the questions remain the same. What does it mean to be whole? What does it mean to suffer? And why, despite everything, do we still reach for hope? Somewhere, on a quiet night by the Nile, a healer once dipped his hands in warm water, preparing for another long battle with the unknown. His tools glinted softly, his shadow danced across the wall, and he whispered a promise that every doctor since has unknowingly repeated: to ease pain, to honor life, and to face what cannot be cured with courage instead of fear. The wind carried that promise across the centuries, and though his name is lost, his vow remains. Because the story of Egyptian medicine isn't just about scalpels or spells, it's about humanity itself, flawed, curious, terrified, and endlessly determined to mend what breaks, even when it's only for a little while. The night breeze drifted through the temple windows, carrying with it the smell of incense, dust, and something faintly metallic. Blood, perhaps, or the copper tools that glinted in the firelight. The healer stood silently for a moment, hand steady, heart steady, mind anything but. Across from him, his patient stared with wide eyes, perhaps wondering whether this was a cure or a sentence. In ancient Egypt, those two outcomes were often indistinguishable. Yet, for all their superstition, for all their devotion to unseen gods, there was something profoundly human about these moments. Every incision, every chant, every desperate prayer whispered into the desert air, each was an attempt to outsmart mortality. It's strange to think that these same people who believed beetles pushed the sun across the sky could perform surgeries with precision that would humble some medieval physicians. Their tools, made of bronze and obsidian, weren't crude relics but masterpieces of function, smooth, curved, designed to cut without shattering bone or tearing skin. Archaeologists have uncovered entire surgical kits, neatly arranged, almost sterile in appearance. The scalpels gleamed, the forceps rested beside hooks and probes. They might not have known the word surgery, but they knew what it meant to open the body to save it. And that's both awe-inspiring and terrifying, because once you've seen what's inside, you can never quite see the world the same way again. They treated fractures by setting bones and wrapping them in resin-soaked bandages that hardened into early casts. They performed amputations, crude but effective, sealing wounds with fire or honey. They even stitched wounds with linen threads so fine that some are still visible in mummies thousands of years later. There's something poetic in that image, a single thread, bridging millennia, connecting a dying farmer to a modern observer. It's as if the Egyptians weren't just patching flesh, they were weaving themselves into time itself. Of course, their methods weren't always elegant. Some treatments read like the confessions of a mad scientist. For snake bites, they prescribed eating raw onions mixed with beer and reciting a spell against creatures that slither. For toothaches, they applied crushed donkey teeth to the gums, presumably because misery loves company. And for infertility, crocodile dung mixed with honey was inserted as a kind of divine intervention, an ancient version of "it can't hurt to try." But maybe that's the point. Their willingness to try anything, no matter how absurd, came from a place of relentless hope. They weren't content to accept suffering as fate. They fought it with every tool, every herb, every wild idea that might tip the balance between life and death. And somewhere beneath the strangeness, there was genuine brilliance. They understood that cleanliness mattered. They washed wounds, used antiseptic ingredients like honey and wine, and wrapped injuries in linen rather than leaving them exposed. They didn't know why it worked, but they noticed that it did. Observation, repetition, improvement. It was the heartbeat of early science, pulsing quietly beneath the hum of their prayers. They learned that pus was a bad sign, that certain smells meant infection, that cleanliness wasn't just holy, it was survival. It's funny how some lessons take humanity thousands of years to relearn, but medicine in Egypt wasn't just about the body, it was theater. Healing was performed with grandeur and drama, a performance for both gods and mortals. The healer's chants weren't just for spiritual protection, they created rhythm, control, focus. The patient's fear became part of the ritual, and the healer's confidence its antidote. Pain was inevitable, but panic was optional. In a way, it's not so different today. Modern doctors wear white coats instead of linen robes, use Latin instead of prayers, but the effect is the same. Authority, reassurance, the illusion of certainty in an uncertain world. We haven't evolved as much as we think. We've just changed costumes. It's worth remembering that not every healer was born equal. Some were scholars trained in temple schools, others mere charlatans who wandered villages selling potions made of lizard tails and optimism. The educated ones studied under the shadow of gods like Thoth and Imhotep, who was perhaps the first doctor ever remembered by name. Imhotep, a man so skilled he was later deified, became the embodiment of wisdom and healing. His temples were hospitals, his statues offerings to the art of medicine. Imagine a world where your family doctor could one day be worshipped. On second thought, maybe don't. Some modern doctors already act like that. Still, there was something humbling in their understanding of limits. The Egyptians didn't expect miracles from medicine. They saw illness as part of a larger story, not merely a malfunction. If a cure failed, it wasn't the doctor's fault. It was the god's decision. That might sound like convenient blame shifting, but it carried a kind of mercy. It allowed the healer to try again without despair and the patient to die without resentment. In our world of lawsuits and statistics, that idea feels almost alien, accepting imperfection as part of the divine order. But the Egyptians weren't fatalists, they were experimenters. Their pharmacies contained hundreds of ingredients: garlic for infections, pomegranate for worms, castor oil for digestion, and aloe for burns. Their combinations often worked, though not always for the reasons they thought. Even their mistakes taught lessons. Every failed remedy, every lost life, pushed them a little closer to understanding. They didn't seek immortality, they sought improvement. And maybe that's why their legacy has survived when so many others have turned to dust. Their influence reached far beyond the Nile. The Greeks studied their scrolls, the Romans copied their practices, and through those cultures, Egyptian wisdom seeped into the very foundation of Western medicine. Today, when we talk about anatomy, hygiene, or the balance of humors, we're echoing ideas that first took shape under the gaze of sphinxes and sandstone gods. The continuity is almost eerie. The scalpel may be sharper now, the prayers forgotten, but the impulse remains the same. To make sense of suffering, to turn pain into progress. And maybe that's what makes their story so haunting. The more we uncover about their medicine, the more we see ourselves reflected in it. The same arrogance, the same compassion, the same desperate hope that tomorrow's cure will fix what today's cannot. The Egyptians wrapped their dead in linen, believing they'd rise again. We wrap our lives in science, believing we'll conquer decay. It's all the same faith, just dressed in different words. Maybe the greatest illusion is thinking we've evolved beyond them. As the healer extinguishes his lamp, the desert outside hums softly. The patient sleeps or drifts somewhere between worlds. The Nile flows, unbothered by the tragedies it has witnessed. And above, the stars keep their quiet watch, just as they always have. In their eternal glow lies the same question that haunted those ancient physicians. How far will we go to outrun death? Maybe the answer is what has kept humanity alive all along, because whether through scalpels or spells, science or superstition, we've never stopped trying. The desert was quiet again. Centuries had passed since the last healer whispered prayers over a trembling patient, but the echoes of their work still lingered in the air. The same wind that once carried the smell of honey, resin, and blood now carried dust over ruins that had seen everything: birth, death, and the unending attempt to hold one off from the other. Medicine in ancient Egypt had never really been about erasing suffering. It was about giving it meaning. And maybe that's why it still fascinates us, because even now, in our world of white walls and blinking machines, we're still looking for meaning inside the body's chaos. There's a strange kind of irony in realizing that a civilization so obsessed with death was also one of the first to master the art of preserving life. The Egyptians didn't fear the body, they revered it. They studied it, cut it open, treated it, and when it finally failed, they turned it into a masterpiece of eternity. In their worldview, the physical form wasn't a disposable shell, it was the vessel of the divine. The body was proof that the gods had sculpted something miraculous, and if something so miraculous could bleed, then it could also be repaired. This simple faith drove them to experiment, to cut, to suture, to mix, to heal, not because they thought they could conquer mortality, but because they believed it was a sacred duty to try. Every illness had a story, and every cure was a narrative in return. A farmer with a broken leg wasn't just a patient. He was a man whose body had fallen out of harmony with Ma'at, the cosmic balance. Healing him wasn't just about resetting bone, it was about resetting the universe, one limb at a time. The physician became both craftsman and priest, guided by logic and by the unseen. There's something strangely familiar in that duality. Even today, we expect our doctors to be both scientists and saints, able to calculate drug doses and also hold our hand when the numbers fail us. Maybe the Egyptians simply understood earlier than we did that healing requires both hands, one steady, one compassionate. Their pursuit of equilibrium extended beyond flesh. They believed that emotions could disrupt health as easily as infection. A heart burdened by guilt could cause fever. A mind consumed by envy could poison the blood. In a way, they were the first to see that the mind and body were not neighbors. They were roommates constantly leaving messes for each other to clean up. The healer's job wasn't just to treat the wound, but to calm the spirit that caused it. That's why their prescriptions often included both physical remedies and emotional rituals. You might get a mixture of herbs for your pain, and alongside it, a prayer to recite at dawn. It's the ancient equivalent of take 2 pills and call me in the morning, only with more incense and less paperwork. But what truly separated Egyptian medicine from others was how deeply it was tied to their identity as a civilization. Healing wasn't a profession, it was part of the social fabric. Temples doubled as hospitals, priests doubled as physicians, and the act of curing someone was a contribution to the eternal order of the cosmos. Imagine if today's doctors were trained in churches or mosques, and surgeries began with hymns instead of anesthesia. It sounds absurd, but for them, it was perfectly natural. Because to heal was to participate in the ongoing conversation between humans and gods, between what can be saved and what must be surrendered. And yet, for all their devotion, they were remarkably practical. They understood the importance of diet, exercise, and hygiene centuries before anyone else bothered to. They advised moderation in food, cleanliness of the body, and rest for the mind. They even prescribed laughter for melancholy, a treatment still effective and still underused. There's something profoundly simple in their wisdom. When life became unbearable, they didn't look for exotic answers. They looked inward, toward balance. You'd think that after 4,000 years, we'd have caught up, but modern humans seem to prefer imbalance with a Wi-Fi connection. Their approach to the senses was particularly fascinating. Smell, touch, taste, all were diagnostic tools. They believed the body spoke through sensation. A bad odor meant imbalance, a bitter taste meant impurity, a cold touch meant retreat of life. Physicians would listen, smell, and taste to interpret what the body was trying to say. It's difficult to imagine a modern doctor doing that without being sued, but their intimacy with the body gave them an instinct no technology can replace. They didn't need machines to tell them when something was wrong. They simply paid attention. Perhaps that's what we've lost in our obsession with precision, the ability to feel our way toward understanding. Their spiritual imagination infused every cure with poetry. To drink a potion was to swallow the words of life. To apply an ointment was to seal the body with divine hands. They transformed medicine into metaphor, which made healing feel magical even when it was mechanical. There's a reason why people still light candles in hospitals, still whisper prayers before surgery. Deep down, we know that even science needs a story to make it bearable. The Egyptians were simply honest about that. They didn't separate medicine from meaning because they understood that the two feed each other. And then there was the legacy they left behind, a silent inheritance woven into the DNA of modern healing. Their hieroglyphs of herbs became the foundations of pharmacology. Their embalming techniques informed the earliest autopsies. Their belief in documenting symptoms laid the groundwork for clinical observation. Even the Hippocratic Oath, that sacred promise of doctors to do no harm, echoes their reverence for life and balance. It's astonishing to think that while most of their monuments crumble, their ideas still walk among us, wearing lab coats instead of linen robes. There's a kind of quiet poetry in how the story circles back. What began in temples now unfolds in hospitals. What began with prayers now hums through ventilators and monitors. The tools are new, but the purpose hasn't changed. Every healer, from an ancient priest chanting over a wound to a modern surgeon holding a scalpel, is part of the same lineage, an unbroken chain of hands defying the inevitable. And maybe that's why, no matter how advanced we become, we still hold on to the small rituals, the comforting touch, the whispered, "You'll be okay," the deep breath before the incision. These are the remnants of a time when healing was divine, and maybe, deep down, we still believe it is. So when we think of ancient Egyptian medicine, it's easy to laugh at the absurdities, the crocodile dung, the spells, the honey and wine. But beneath that strangeness lies something profoundly human, the refusal to accept helplessness. They looked at disease and saw not punishment, but opportunity, a chance to collaborate with the universe rather than surrender to it. Their medicine wasn't perfect. It was messy, mystical, often misguided, but it was also brave. And maybe that's the most valuable thing they left us. Not their cures, but their courage. As the night falls again over the ruins of their temples, the sand shifting softly over forgotten tombs, the stars above look exactly as they did when those first healers raised their hands toward the sky and promised to make pain meaningful. The tools may have rusted, the papyri may have faded, but that promise never died. It lives in every bandage wrapped, every wound stitched, every breath restored. Because in the end, healing has always been less about erasing pain and more about reminding the living that they are still here. And somewhere, if you listen closely enough, the wind still carries the echo of an ancient vow whispered on the banks of the Nile, a promise older than time itself, that as long as we draw breath, we will keep trying to mend what breaks, no matter how impossible it seems. The Nile glimmered like liquid glass under the morning sun, a slow artery pulsing through the veins of a civilization that refused to die. Along its banks, life unfolded with rhythm and precision, as if the river itself dictated the heartbeat of Egypt. Fishermen hauled nets, farmers tended fields, and somewhere beyond the reeds, in the cool shadow of a limestone temple, a healer opened his scrolls and prepared for another day of wrestling with mortality. His tools were few, his faith endless. In a world where gods walked invisibly among men, medicine was never simply a craft. It was an act of reverence, a negotiation between what could be seen and what forever slipped through human fingers. The healer's first patient arrived at dawn, limping on a wounded leg from a chariot accident. There was no anesthesia, no sterile room, only the smell of herbs and the murmurs of prayers. The healer washed the wound with wine, applied a paste of honey and resin, and recited words meant to keep evil spirits at bay. Pain, after all, was not just physical. It was a sign of disharmony, of something spiritual gone astray. The man winced, bit his lip, and whispered the name of a god under his breath. The healer didn't flinch. Pain was part of the cure, and in ancient Egypt, endurance was proof of faith. If you could survive the treatment, the gods might just reward you with life. In a world so steeped in divinity, the boundaries between doctor, priest, and magician blurred. A healer's scroll might contain a recipe for ointment and a charm to invoke divine protection, written on the same line. One for the body, one for the soul, because the Egyptians refused to separate them. They believed illness came from imbalance, that the body mirrored the cosmos, and that healing one meant healing both. It's funny how modern science spends billions to rediscover what they already knew, that your thoughts can make you sick, and your spirit can make you strong. The Egyptians might not have had laboratories, but they had something just as powerful, faith disguised as medicine. Their understanding of anatomy came not only from treating the living, but also from tending the dead. Embalmers, those silent architects of eternity, were surgeons of a sort, though their patients never complained. They learned how to remove organs without destroying the body, how to preserve flesh for millennia, how to turn decay into divinity. Every mummy was both a memorial and a manual. The embalmers didn't know it, but their rituals were lessons in biology, an education carved in the language of eternity. While most civilizations buried their dead and forgot, Egypt studied them, learned from them, made them teachers for all time. There's a strange comfort in that, knowing that the dead, quite literally, gave life to medicine. Their surgical techniques were both brutal and brilliant. They could treat broken bones, remove tumors, even perform circumcisions and amputations with shocking precision. The instruments they used, scalpels, forceps, clamps, were works of art in bronze and copper. Some looked so modern that when archaeologists first uncovered them, they assumed they were misplaced tools from the 19th century. But no, these were the creations of minds that dared to imagine that flesh could be fixed, that blood could be persuaded to stop flowing. Each instrument was a testament to their conviction that the human body was not an accident, but a masterpiece worth repairing. What's even more fascinating is how they recorded everything. The Edwin Smith Papyrus reads like an ancient medical textbook, filled with case studies and treatment notes. It's methodical, logical, almost shockingly scientific for its time. One passage calmly describes how to treat a skull fracture, while another instructs when to give up and let the gods decide. There's an honesty to that kind of medicine, the humility to admit that not everything can be saved. Maybe that's what makes it so timeless, because even now, with all our technology, we still face that same truth. Sometimes the only cure is acceptance, yet their doctors were far from emotionless. They treated with empathy, with ritual, with patience. A physician was expected to know not only the ingredients of a remedy, but also the temperament of his patient. A man prone to anger needed cooling herbs. A woman with sorrow needed warming oils. Healing for them was not a formula. It was a conversation. They listened not just to the body, but to the story behind it. And in that sense, they were light years ahead of us. Today, a doctor might glance at your chart for 30 seconds before prescribing a pill. An Egyptian healer would spend hours reading your spirit. Maybe the ancients understood something we've forgotten. That people don't heal when they're fixed, they heal when they're understood. Even their failures carried wisdom. When a patient died, they didn't hide it. They documented it, studied it, honored it. They believed death was not an end, but a continuation, a transformation. The healer's duty didn't stop at the grave, it simply changed form. The same hands that had bandaged wounds might later prepare the same body for mummification, an act of reverence as much as anatomy. There was no shame in death, only mystery. Perhaps that's why their medicine was so fearless. Well, you can't fear death if you believe it's only another kind of life. What makes it all so haunting is how much of it endures. The herbs they used still grow along the Nile. The chants they recited still echo in the margins of history. Even now, we find fragments of their remedies in modern pharmaceuticals. Honey and wound care, willow bark and aspirin, castor oil and medicine cabinets. It's as if their knowledge never truly vanished, only evolved, like a patient who never dies but keeps changing form. The Egyptians might have built pyramids for their kings, but their greatest monuments were invisible, the ideas that still breathe in our hospitals and pharmacies today. And through all of it, through blood and prayer, through superstition and science, there was a quiet, unshakable truth that anchored their world. Healing was sacred. It wasn't about defying nature, it was about working with it. They saw the body as a small version of the universe, a vessel that reflected the harmony or chaos of existence itself. To cure someone was to restore that harmony, to bring them back into alignment with the divine rhythm of life. You can almost picture it, the healer placing his hand over a wound, whispering to the gods, believing that somewhere between his breath and their will, the balance would return. And maybe that's what keeps their story alive. Because every time we look into a microscope or hold a patient's hand, we're doing the same thing, seeking order in chaos, light in darkness, meaning in pain. The tools have changed, but the motive hasn't. We still chase the same dream that flickered in the lamplight of those temples, that even against impossible odds, the act of trying to heal is itself a victory. The Egyptians didn't just give us medicine, they gave us the courage to keep fighting for it. As the sun dips over the desert, the last rays catch the carvings on a temple wall, scenes of healers, priests, and patients bound in the same eternal dance. Their faces are gone, their names forgotten, but their story still breathes through us. Because healing, at its core, has never been about living forever. It's about making life, however fleeting, sacred. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear their whisper carried on the wind, the same whisper that has guided every healer since the dawn of time. Do not fear death. Fear only the day you stop trying to save life. The morning sun climbed lazily over the dunes, stretching its light across temples and tombs, bathing the sands in gold as if trying to remind Egypt of its own eternal glow. Somewhere near the banks of the Nile, a healer stirred from sleep. His day would begin, as it always did, between the sacred and the ordinary, where the scent of herbs mingled with incense and the sound of prayer mingled with the groans of the sick. To be a healer in this world was to exist between two realities, one ruled by the gods and another by the human body, that fragile clay constantly threatening to crumble, and every sunrise felt like an invitation to hold those two worlds together for just a little longer. The healer's tools waited for him, laid out with care: bronze scalpels, polished stones, bone needles, jars of unidentifiable mixtures that could either cure fever or summon visions of the afterlife, depending on who you asked. Each item told a story. There was a cup that once held wine used to dull pain during surgery, a cloth stained with dried blood and honey, a reed used to measure the depth of a wound. They weren't just tools, they were extensions of faith. In the silence before his first patient arrived, the healer whispered a small prayer, not for perfection, but for steadiness, because in Egypt, medicine was less about mastery and more about balance between body and soul, courage and fear, science and superstition. His first patient that morning was a woman who had come from miles away, clutching her side, believing that an angry spirit lived in her belly. The healer listened carefully, his fingers tracing the air as if feeling for invisible threads. He didn't laugh, didn't correct her, didn't say the word infection. Instead, he prescribed a mixture of honey, cumin, and prayers to Isis, the goddess of protection. And maybe it worked because the woman left with lighter steps and a calmer face. Perhaps it was the herbs, perhaps it was belief. But then again, isn't that the essence of healing even now? A delicate illusion of control, a ritual we repeat to convince the mind that the body can follow. He spent his afternoons among apprentices, teaching them the way others might teach poetry. He showed them how to watch the skin change color, how to hear truth in the tone of a cough, how to smell sickness before it speaks. His lessons were less about memorization and more about intuition. A good healer, he would say, listens not only to what the patient says, but to what the silence hides. You could almost imagine the young apprentices nodding solemnly, trying not to fall asleep, while secretly wondering if they'd ever be brave enough to slice into living flesh. It takes courage to cut open a mystery, even when you believe the gods are on your side. And courage they needed because Egypt, despite its beauty, was not gentle. Life along the Nile came with scorpions, fevers, snake bites, infections, and accidents born of labor. The healer's tent was always full, and each case was a new equation of faith and anatomy. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they failed, but failure wasn't the end. It was instruction. If a patient died, the healer studied the body, learned its secrets, and carved its memory into his practice. There was no arrogance in his craft, only curiosity. Perhaps that's what made Egyptian medicine so enduring. It wasn't built on certainty, but on observation, humility, and a quiet conversation with nature. Their knowledge extended far beyond the obvious. They recognized the pulse as a sign of vitality, treated burns with mixtures of milk and resin, and used garlic as a remedy for infections. They even practiced forms of dentistry that would make modern patients shudder, drilling into decayed teeth with bronze instruments and filling cavities with powdered minerals. Pain was unavoidable, but they saw it as part of purification. To suffer was to cleanse, to bleed was to prove devotion. Maybe that sounds barbaric, but think about it. People today voluntarily run marathons for the same reason. Humanity hasn't changed. We've just upgraded our excuses for pain. In the evenings, when the heat faded and the air filled with the scent of river lilies, the healer would often look at the stars and think. To him, they were not distant suns, but divine eyes watching over his work. He wondered if the gods measured his success not in lives saved, but in how much compassion he carried through failure. The Egyptians believed that the heart recorded every action and emotion, that it would one day be weighed in the afterlife against the feather of truth. And so each treatment, each decision became a spiritual act. Healing wasn't just about survival, it was about earning a lighter heart. There was beauty even in their mistakes. Some of their remedies sound absurd now: crocodile dung for contraception, pig's ear for earaches. But behind the absurdity lay an audacity to experiment. They didn't fear failure, they feared stagnation. For them, the worst illness wasn't infection but ignorance, and that's something we might reflect on. In an age when we rely on machines to think for us, their raw curiosity feels revolutionary. They didn't have textbooks or data. They had patterns, instincts, and the courage to try. Sometimes that meant they stumbled into brilliance, other times into disaster. But at least they moved forward. Their philosophy of balance seeped into everything they touched. The same principle that guided their architecture, the symmetry of pyramids, the alignment of temples, also guided their medicine. A fever was heat unbalanced by cold. A limp was structure unbalanced by motion. Sadness was spirit unbalanced by purpose. Every remedy was an attempt to restore harmony, not domination. That's why their cures often involved song, scent, and ritual. To heal the body without soothing the soul was like repairing a boat without patching its leaks. It would only sink again. Sometimes, after long days, the healer would sit alone, his fingers stained with herbs and honey, and wonder if he'd done enough. He knew that every cure carried a cost. Every act of healing borrowed something from it. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was emotional, almost spiritual. But then he'd remember that his work was part of something bigger, something eternal. His hands were mortal, yes, but the act of healing was divine. He wasn't trying to outwit death. He was trying to keep life meaningful until death arrived. And that, perhaps, is the truest definition of medicine. As the night deepened and the stars shimmered like scattered jewels over the desert, he looked once more at his tools before blowing out the lamp. The instruments caught the last flicker of light, glinting like small promises. Promises that pain could be eased, that the body could be mended, that compassion itself was a kind of immortality. Outside, the river kept flowing, its current carrying away whispers of prayers, laughter, and grief, erasing the day's sorrows while preparing for another dawn. And somewhere in that endless rhythm, between the heartbeat of the Nile and the silence of eternity, the spirit of Egyptian healing continued its quiet work, reminding the living that while death may always win, life has the better story. The desert night could be deceiving. It looked eternal, unchanging, silent. But beneath that stillness, life pulsed with the same urgency it always had. Healers mixing salves by firelight, patients murmuring prayers into the dark, and somewhere, the Nile whispering its eternal song to those willing to listen. In Egypt, even silence was alive. And it was in this silence that medicine often happened, not with grand gestures or miracles, but with quiet persistence. The healer's hand, steady despite exhaustion, the patient's breath, shallow but hopeful, the belief that tomorrow the pain might lessen. In a world ruled by gods and kings, perhaps the truest power was held by those who dared to believe in healing at all. The healer's hut was humble, a small sanctuary of smoke, jars, and strange aromas. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling, bundles of papyrus littered the table, and a small copper mirror caught the glint of lamplight, reflecting the tired face of its owner. He wasn't a man of wealth or fame, but of trust. People came to him not because he was divine, but because he cared. And that, in a civilization that built monuments to eternity, might have been the rarest thing of all. Healers carried the weight of gods without the luxury of immortality. They failed, they wept, they tried again, and in doing so, they stitched something far more enduring than mummies or pyramids. They stitched hope into the very fabric of human history. Every wound had a story, and every cure was a negotiation. A farmer's infection wasn't just an injury, it was punishment from a neglected deity. A child's fever wasn't merely sickness, it was a whisper from the afterlife, reminding the living to be humble. And yet, the healer treated them all the same, with patience, herbs, and whispered blessings. There's something profoundly moving about that kind of equal faith. Whether he was treating a nobleman or a slave, he knew pain sounded the same in every language. It screamed, it begged, it bargained. And perhaps that's why the Egyptians saw healing as sacred. Pain didn't discriminate, so neither could compassion. Their remedies were often as strange as they were ingenious. A poultice of moldy bread for wounds, pig's fat for burns, honey for infections, even powdered gold for spiritual ailments. It's easy to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but then you realize moldy bread contains penicillin, honey is a natural antiseptic, and gold has anti-inflammatory properties. The line between superstition and science isn't always as thick as we think. Maybe the Egyptians weren't primitive. Maybe they were just early adapters who didn't bother writing lab reports. You can almost picture an ancient healer muttering, "If it works," while grinding beetle wings into powder. But perhaps the most striking thing about Egyptian medicine wasn't what they treated. It was how they treated. They understood that the act of healing went beyond the body. They used words like instruments, believing that language itself could realign the soul. A healer might whisper charms as he cleaned a wound, his voice steady and low, the rhythm lulling the patient into calm. It wasn't just poetry, it was early psychology. They knew that fear was the enemy of healing, and that soothing the mind was as crucial as tending to the flesh. Modern medicine might call it bedside manner. They called it magic. Their concept of balance guided everything they did. Too much heat in the body meant inflammation. Too much cold meant weakness. Too much emotion disturbed the heart. Too much rest invited decay. Harmony was everything. Even their cities reflected this obsession. The symmetry of temples, the alignment of tombs, the measured flow of the Nile mirrored their belief that health was simply another kind of equilibrium. They didn't separate medicine from philosophy, because for them, the body was a philosophy. An essay written in bone and blood about what it means to stay alive. The Temple of Kam-Ombo stood as a shining example of this belief. Dedicated to both Sobek, the crocodile god of strength, and Horus, the falcon god of healing, it embodied duality, danger and recovery, destruction and renewal. Within its halls, medical students learned to treat wounds, while priests taught them to respect the invisible forces that governed fate. The walls were carved with surgical instruments, meticulous in detail, almost reverent. It's humbling to imagine that a civilization 4,000 years old built its hospitals like cathedrals. Maybe they understood something we've forgotten. That healing is sacred not because it's miraculous, but because it's human. Sometimes the healer would look at his patients and see reflections of himself. He too suffered, though not always visibly. His hands ached from long hours. His faith wavered after each loss, and yet he carried on. He had no luxury of despair. For every man he couldn't save, there was another waiting outside, bleeding, coughing, or praying. So he continued, because stopping wasn't an option. It's an image that feels almost modern, the exhausted physician working late, trying to hold back a tide of suffering that never truly recedes. Time changes tools, not burdens. Their relationship with death was complex, almost intimate. They didn't see it as an adversary to be conquered, but as an inevitable part of the cycle they served. A healer who lost a patient didn't curse the gods. He thanked them for the lesson. Death wasn't failure, it was transition. The Egyptians believed that to die was to return to balance, to the same order from which life emerged. In that sense, healing wasn't about postponing death. It was about preparing for it with dignity. That mindset might sound morbid to us, but maybe it's the healthiest one of all. After all, what greater peace is there than accepting that every life is both a beginning and an end woven seamlessly together? There were times, though, when even faith faltered. When epidemics swept through villages, when fevers claimed children faster than prayers could be whispered, when the gods felt absent, the healer would stand helpless among the dying, his remedies failing, his chants falling flat. And yet, even then, he didn't stop. He tended to bodies he knew would not survive, not because he believed in victory, but because compassion demanded it. That's the quiet heroism of ancient medicine. It wasn't built on triumph, but on persistence. Healing wasn't always about saving lives. Sometimes it was about giving suffering a witness. And still, beneath all the gravity, there was humor, because even in ancient Egypt, people found ways to laugh through pain. A healer might roll his eyes at a patient who claimed to be cursed by a neighbor's cat, or smirk while preparing crocodile dung as a miracle remedy. Humor was a kind of medicine too, a reminder that not every wound was fatal, and not every day ended in tragedy. You can almost hear their laughter echoing through time, faint but stubborn, like the heartbeat of humanity refusing to fade. As the night deepened and the healer stepped outside, the desert stretched endlessly before him, silent except for the whispering wind. The stars shone above. Those same stars he believed were the eyes of the gods, watching, waiting, listening. He closed his eyes, breathed in the cool air, and for a moment felt something vast and inexplicable stir inside him. He realized that every cure, every prayer, every failure was part of the same story. The story of human hands trying to mend the fragile bridge between body and soul. And though the sands would one day bury his name, his work would never die. Because healing, like the Nile, never truly stops. It just keeps flowing quietly, endlessly, carrying everything that once was into everything that will be. The moon hung over the Nile like a polished scarab, glowing faintly in the still air. Somewhere between the whispering reeds and the distant murmur of frogs, a healer's lamp flickered, throwing long shadows against mud brick walls. Inside, the scent of incense mixed with something less divine, burnt resin, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of blood. The healer's hands, calloused and steady, hovered over a patient's chest. It wasn't just a wound he was treating, it was a story, a message written in pain. Every injury carried a narrative, and his task was to translate it. In Egypt, the body was more than flesh. It was the diary of the soul, and every scar was a chapter written by the gods. He leaned closer, muttering softly, not out of superstition, but concentration. Healing, after all, was a form of prayer. The ancient Egyptians had long understood something the modern world often forgets, that there's a rhythm to life that medicine can't always quantify. Their treatments were guided not only by logic, but by harmony, an understanding that balance itself was health. When the heart beat out of tune with the spirit, sickness crept in. And so, to cure a man was not simply to stitch a wound, it was to realign him with the cosmic order. In their worldview, every cut was a miniature rebellion against the gods, and every cure an act of forgiveness. As strange as their medicine sometimes appears to us, it was rooted in remarkable observation. They studied the pulse centuries before it had a name, recognized the link between food and disease, and even used castor oil as a laxative, a practice that continues, for better or worse, to this day. They were empirical without realizing it, blending what worked with what was believed. Perhaps that's the secret of their longevity as a culture. They never saw contradiction between faith and experiment. To them, testing a cure was an act of devotion. Discovering one was divine approval. There's something humbling in that. Imagine a doctor today beginning an operation with a prayer to Thoth and ending with a note in a medical journal. It would sound absurd, yet somehow honest. Their rituals extended far beyond medicine itself. Healing wasn't confined to temples or clinics. It happened in kitchens, by riversides, under palm trees. Mothers brewed teas of coriander and chamomile for stomach aches. Priests prescribed amulets against fevers, and neighbors shared remedies that were half science, half gossip. Medicine was a community affair, an open-source project of survival, and maybe that's why it thrived, because healing wasn't about hierarchy, it was about humanity. The poorest farmer and the mightiest pharaoh both bled red. Both prayed for mercy when fever struck. Pain was the great equalizer, and in Egypt, even kings were humbled by it. That humility found expression in their art. Temple walls didn't just glorify war and worship, they celebrated healing. Reliefs showed surgeons holding knives with reverence, not aggression. They depicted childbirth, dentistry, and herbal preparation alongside battles and coronations, as if to remind the viewer that civilization wasn't measured by conquest, but by compassion. The same hands that built pyramids also learned to stitch flesh. And perhaps that's the true miracle of Egypt. Not that they reached for eternity, but that they cared enough to heal each other along the way. Even their mistakes spoke of brilliance. They believed the heart was the seat of thought and emotion, not the brain. It sounds foolish now, yet who can deny that heartbreak feels more real than a headache? They saw truth in sensation long before science could dissect it. To them, the body was a compass for meaning, not a puzzle to be solved. And while they may have misjudged anatomy, they grasped psychology instinctively. They treated sadness with music, loneliness with fragrance, grief with ritual. Modern therapists call that holistic care. The Egyptians simply called it living. And then there was the laughter, the unexpected cure. Though little is written about it, there's evidence that humor was a form of medicine, even in the land of mummies. At festivals, jesters mocked priests, dancers mimicked pharaohs, and crowds roared with laughter. It wasn't rebellion, it was release. In a culture so obsessed with death, laughter was an act of survival, a way of reminding themselves that life still had flavor. Maybe that's why even the gods had mischievous streaks. The goddess Hathor, after all, was both patron of joy and nurse of the sick. She healed through dance and music, proving that sometimes the best remedy isn't a potion, it's perspective. The healer knew this well. Between patients, he'd hum songs to keep his spirits intact. He'd seen enough sickness to know that despair spread faster than any disease. He'd once said, half-jokingly, "The first medicine a man must take is hope. All other remedies are just the spoon." His apprentices laughed, thinking it was another one of his strange sayings, but there was truth buried in it. Without hope, no cure lasted. Without laughter, no recovery began. Maybe that's why ancient Egypt endured, because it understood that survival was a kind of faith, one that demanded humor as much as devotion. When night finally descended and his lamp burned low, the healer would step outside, gaze up at the sky, and think of those who came before him. His teachers, long gone. The patients he couldn't save, the ones he did, the faces blurred together in the half-light of memory. He imagined them walking into the afterlife, their bodies restored, their pains forgotten. He found comfort in that image, not because he believed he had defied death, but because he had made it gentler. Every bandage tied, every fever soothed, every life prolonged. It all mattered. Even if the gods never noticed, humanity did. The desert wind stirred, whispering across the sand, carrying the scent of the Nile and the faint memory of incense. He smiled, realizing that his work was part of something endless. The tools would rust, the scrolls would crumble, the temples would sink beneath the earth. But the act of healing would continue. It would cross centuries, change names, evolve languages, but its soul would remain the same. Because medicine, at its core, has always been a simple promise between two fragile beings, one in pain and one who refuses to let that pain win. And as he turned back to his hut, the healer whispered one last prayer, not for himself, but for those who would come after. For the healers who would wield steel instead of bronze, electricity instead of incense, reason instead of ritual. He prayed that they would remember what he had learned under the flicker of lamplight, that healing isn't about conquering death, but about honoring life. The gods might change their names, the tools might change their shapes, but compassion, that ancient, stubborn pulse, would always remain the truest medicine. And as the night swallowed his figure and the lamp dimmed, the Nile kept flowing, carrying with it the eternal truth that every cure, every act of kindness, ripples outward long after the hands that made it are gone. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the horizon, painting the sand in shades of amber and rose. The healer, already awake, stood by the riverbank, washing his hands in the cold current. His fingers were stained with the residue of herbs and honey, faint reminders of yesterday's battles against fever and infection. He stared at his reflection in the rippling water, half expecting to see a stranger looking back. The lines on his face were deeper now, carved by years of saving lives and losing them. In ancient Egypt, to heal was to play tug-of-war with the gods, and some mornings he wasn't sure who was winning. Yet even in the fatigue of endless work, there was something sacred in the routine. The sun rose, the Nile flowed, and people still came, carrying their wounds and their faith in equal measure. It was easy to forget sometimes that this world believed medicine was an act of balance, not conquest. Every cure was a negotiation, not a declaration of victory. The healer had learned early on that arrogance had no place here. You didn't command the body to obey. You persuaded it, coaxed it back toward harmony. Maybe that's why their medicine worked better than it should have. It wasn't just about herbs and scalpels, it was about rhythm. They treated illness the way they treated the seasons, understanding that nothing truly dies. It merely shifts form. Pain, too, was a teacher, and healing wasn't the erasure of pain, but the transformation of it. The healer's next patient was a young scribe, pale and trembling, clutching his chest as though trying to keep his heart from escaping. His family whispered that he was cursed, that he had insulted the goddess Maat by falsifying temple records. The healer listened carefully, then smiled, a patient smile, the kind that disarms both fear and superstition. He examined the boy, felt his pulse, and recognized what we would now call anxiety. There were no demons, no divine punishments, just a man crushed beneath the weight of his own conscience. Instead of exorcising him, the healer prescribed something far simpler: rest, a few prayers, and a concoction of herbs to calm the nerves. The boy was healed within days, though his family insisted it was because the gods forgave him. The healer didn't argue. Sometimes belief did half the work, and who was he to steal credit from the divine? It was moments like that when he realized that medicine was, in many ways, a form of storytelling. Every diagnosis was a narrative, every cure a resolution. You had to convince the patient that healing was possible, not just probable. Words mattered as much as remedies. A man who believed in his own recovery often recovered faster, as if the body simply followed the plot laid out for it. Modern scientists might call it the placebo effect. The Egyptians called it faith. Either way, it worked. And perhaps that's why the healer had lived long enough to see generations of patients pass through his door, each leaving behind a little more trust in the strange miracle of being alive. There were, of course, moments of absurdity that even faith couldn't disguise. He once treated a merchant who came complaining of a swollen stomach. The man was convinced he'd been cursed by a rival and demanded a ritual purification. The healer, after much persuasion, convinced him to drink a strong laxative made from figs and castor oil. Hours later, the curse had been removed in a way both dramatic and undeniably effective. The merchant paid handsomely and spread word of the healer's miraculous powers. It was a reminder that sometimes the line between divine intervention and good digestion was thinner than anyone cared to admit. Still, beneath the humor, there was always humility. The healer knew that for every life saved, there was another he couldn't reach. When the fever took hold too deeply or the wound festered beyond repair, he stayed with the dying, reciting gentle hymns to guide them toward the afterlife. There was no shame in failure, only in apathy. Each death taught him something new, something unspeakable but true. That healing was never about defying death, but about making life meaningful in the shadow of it. The Egyptians didn't see mortality as defeat. They saw it as a doorway, and the healer's role was simply to help people walk through it with grace. That understanding shaped every part of their medical philosophy. They viewed the heart not as a pump, but as the moral compass of the soul, the recorder of truth and sin alike. The brain, curiously, was dismissed as filler, a cooling agent for the blood, nothing more. Yet, in a way, they weren't wrong to focus on the heart. They understood that emotions ruled health. Grief could sicken the body, anger could curdle the blood, guilt could tighten the chest. Modern psychology took millennia to catch up, inventing fancy terms like psychosomatic, while the Egyptians had already known that the body listens to the soul's whispers. You can't heal the flesh if the spirit is still bleeding. Even their surgeries carried the weight of ritual. The healer's tools were cleaned in wine, laid upon linen, and blessed before use. Each cut began with a prayer to Thoth for wisdom and to Sekhmet for restraint. The procedures were often brutal but effective. Trepanations relieved pressure in the skull, amputations prevented gangrene, sutures closed wounds with surprising precision. There were no painkillers save for strong wine and faith, and yet patients often survived. Perhaps pain itself became part of the ritual, a kind of purification. To endure suffering was to prove strength, to align oneself once again with the will of the gods. And maybe, in a strange way, they were right, because pain, when survived, often leaves behind a kind of clarity that comfort never can. The healer's nights were quieter, but heavier. He'd sit by his lamp, recording the day's cases on papyrus, his handwriting sharp but weary. Each scroll became a testament to humanity's endless battle against decay. He didn't see himself as a genius, only as a witness. He was preserving knowledge the way others preserved bodies. One day, long after he was gone, perhaps another healer would unroll these same scrolls, read his words, and understand that every remedy was a question, not an answer. Maybe that's what progress truly is, an inheritance of curiosity passed from one pair of trembling hands to another. Outside, the Nile shimmered under the moonlight, eternal as always, moving with slow grace as if indifferent to the lives it sustained. The healer watched it, sensing that his time was nearing its end. But he felt no fear. He had done his part, played his role in the long, unbroken chain of those who dared to care. His students would carry his work forward, blending his knowledge with their own discoveries. The river would outlast them all, but their hands, their compassion, their faith, those would ripple forever, invisible yet unending. And so he sat there in the fading light, smiling faintly at the irony of it all. The gods had given humans a body that could bleed, break, and ache, and yet, within that same fragile shell, They'd hidden the capacity to heal, to adapt, to love. Maybe the real secret of Egyptian medicine wasn't in the herbs or the spells, but in that quiet defiance, the refusal to give up on life, even when death stood at the door. The healer blew out his lamp, letting darkness settle over the room like a final blessing. Outside, the Nile kept whispering, carrying stories downstream, the stories of those who healed, those who hoped, and those who dared to believe that even the smallest act of care could echo forever. The night in Thebes was thick with heat and perfume, the kind that clung to your lungs and made the world feel like it was holding its breath. Somewhere in the city's maze of narrow streets, a healer sat cross-legged in the glow of a flickering oil lamp, the flame trembling like a nervous pupil. His hut was a chaos of clay jars and linen, half-finished scrolls and bundles of herbs that looked suspiciously like weeds. To an outsider, it might have seemed messy, but to him it was a living map of knowledge. Each smell, each fragment of dried leaf told a story about pain and survival. Medicine was not an occupation here. It was a conversation with the gods conducted through plants, prayers, and patience. He had once been a scribe, trained to record the words of others, but life had taught him that the body writes its own language, one written in fever, swelling, and silence. So he became a reader of flesh instead of papyrus. When a patient came to him, he didn't just examine them, he interpreted them. A cough was a complaint. A rash was a confession. Every wound carried a message, and he took them all seriously. The irony, of course, was that no one ever thanked him for reading their suffering correctly. They thanked the gods. He didn't mind. Pride was a luxury for people who didn't spend their evenings elbow deep in other people's blood. His favorite patients were children, not because they were easy to cure, but because they hadn't yet learned to lie about their pain. Adults were different. They wrapped their misery in stories. They wanted to sound noble, even in sickness. A merchant with a limp would insist he'd been kicked by a donkey while rescuing someone from drowning. The healer knew the truth. He'd tripped over his own ego. But he would nod solemnly and apply the ointment anyway. After all, curing the body was simpler than curing pride. Humans have always preferred drama to honesty, and Egypt was no exception. Some evenings, he treated soldiers returned from campaigns, men whose bodies were maps of scars and unspoken memories. They sat in silence while he stitched their flesh, each needle prick a reminder that survival doesn't always feel like victory. The wine they drank to dull the pain was both anesthetic and confession. By the third cup, they would talk about ghosts, about friends who hadn't made it back, about the sound of arrows that still echoed in their dreams. The healer never judged them. He knew that trauma wasn't a wound the eye could see. And maybe, in some small way, that made him the first therapist in history, a man who stitched skin but also listened to souls unravel. There was one soldier he remembered vividly, a tall man with eyes too young for the weight they carried. His arm was broken, the bone jutting awkwardly beneath the skin. The healer reset it carefully, using wooden splints bound with linen soaked in honey and resin. The soldier didn't flinch. Instead, he told a story about watching a temple collapse during battle, how the priests said it was the wrath of a forgotten god. Maybe the gods are just tired, the soldier had said with a faint smile. Maybe they need healing too. The healer laughed then, a rare sound in his hut. He wondered if the gods ever looked down and thought the same about humans, that maybe, collectively, we were the ones in need of spiritual surgery. His remedies were not always beautiful, but they worked more often than not. He mixed garlic with crushed dates to fight infections, brewed papyrus root and wine for stomach pains, and used ground limestone to stop bleeding. To modern eyes, it might seem primitive, yet most of these ingredients would still be found centuries later in apothecaries. Progress, he thought, was just memory that refused to die. And the funny part was, every time a treatment worked, someone would write a hymn thanking the gods, not the healer. It was the world's earliest version of getting no credit at work. Still, he found comfort in the rhythm of it. Healing had its own kind of music, a pulse that ran deeper than praise. He often marveled at the strange intimacy of his job. To heal someone was to enter their most fragile state. He had seen the proudest nobles cry like children and the poorest peasants show more courage than kings. Suffering, he realized, was the one language all humans spoke fluently. It stripped away titles, pride, and pretension. When a person was in pain, they became honest, and honesty was sacred. That was the true temple he served, not the stone one with priests chanting hymns, but the trembling heart of a human being willing to say, "I need help." Sometimes he caught himself wondering whether medicine changed people or merely revealed who they already were. He had seen kindness bloom in the shadow of pain and cruelty vanish in the face of death. Illness, he thought, was a kind of mirror, one that reflected not the body but the soul. The sick were forced to confront what the healthy spent their lives avoiding, that control is an illusion and that life is always, at best, a temporary arrangement. It was humbling knowledge and yet strangely freeing. And once you accepted your fragility, fear lost most of its power. The healer's own body was starting to betray him now. His back ached, his eyes blurred, and his hands trembled when he worked too long. He joked that it was poetic justice. After years of patching others, his own body was demanding repayment. but he refused to retire. Healing wasn't something you stopped doing, it was something that lived in your hands until your last breath. Besides, he had apprentices now, young men and women eager to learn, their eyes full of the same restless curiosity he'd once had. He taught them everything: how to read the pulse, how to mix poultices, how to hide your doubts behind a steady voice. If they see fear in your eyes, he told them, they'll lose faith before you even begin. Confidence, he knew, was sometimes the most powerful medicine of all. One night, as a sandstorm raged outside, he sat with his apprentices around a dim fire, telling them stories of his early days. They asked if he ever doubted the gods. He smiled and said, "I never doubted the gods. I doubted the priests." They laughed, though quietly. It was a dangerous kind of humor in a land where faith and politics were tangled like vines. But there was truth in his jest. He didn't think the gods were cruel or kind, they were simply indifferent. Healing, he believed, was humanity's rebellion against that indifference. To mend a body was to defy chaos, to insist that life still mattered even when the universe didn't seem to care. As the storm died and the fire burned low, he realized how much the world around him had changed. The medicine he practiced would one day evolve, the rituals simplified, the prayers forgotten, but the essence of it, the compassion, the courage, the absurd, beautiful stubbornness of trying to keep each other alive, would remain. He thought of all the healers yet to come, the ones who would wield scalpels instead of obsidian blades, who would fight bacteria instead of curses, who would work under fluorescent lights instead of moonlight. And he smiled, because deep down he knew they were all part of the same lineage, a chain of hands stretching across time, each one passing on a fragment of hope. When he finally lay down to rest, the lamp flickered once, twice, then went out. Outside, the Nile murmured softly, carrying fragments of songs, prayers, and laughter from distant villages. The healer's hut was dark now, but his work was not done. It never would be. Somewhere, another healer was mixing herbs by another river under another sky, whispering the same silent promise that has guided humanity since the dawn of time, that no matter how fragile life is, we will always try to make it last just a little longer. And maybe that, he thought before sleep claimed him, is the closest thing to immortality any of us will ever know. The air in Memphis that morning was heavy with dust and the scent of freshly crushed herbs. A thin mist rose from the Nile, curling through the narrow streets like a ghost reluctant to leave. The healer walked slowly, his linen robes brushing against the earth, his steps steady but tired. Years of practice had given him a certain grace. He moved not as a man rushing to save lives, but as someone who had accepted that every life was already part of a larger rhythm. The birds, the river, the dying, the newborn, it all pulsed to the same silent drumbeat. And somehow that realization made his work both easier and infinitely harder. He had seen enough to know that medicine was never just about fixing bodies. It was about repairing balance. People came to him with broken bones, yes, but also with broken hearts, broken faith, and broken luck. They came because they believed he had access to something beyond logic, something invisible, and maybe, he thought, that was true. Healing often felt less like science and more like translation, interpreting the language of pain, deciphering what the body was trying to say when words failed. The problem was that sometimes the body lied. Sometimes it begged for mercy when it needed strength, or stayed silent just long enough to betray itself. One afternoon, a woman arrived from a distant village. Her husband carried her, her skin pale as papyrus, her breath shallow and uneven. The family had already spent their savings on temple offerings, pleading with the gods for help, but the gods had remained quiet. The healer placed a hand on her forehead, feeling the fever's stubborn pulse. He knew she was fading. He mixed honey and herbs, burned incense to drive away evil air, and prayed in whispers. But even as he worked, he knew the truth. There are moments when healing is not about saving a life, but about softening the way it leaves. When the woman finally exhaled her last breath, the healer closed her eyes gently. Her husband wept, and the healer said nothing. He'd learned long ago that grief didn't need words, it needed space. As the family left, he cleaned his hands in silence. Death, to him, was no longer shocking. What struck him more was how love and loss always came together, inseparable as the banks of the Nile. He'd begun to see healing not as a battle against death, but as a conversation with it. You couldn't defeat it. You could only delay its hunger by another sunrise, another heartbeat. And yet, wasn't that enough? Every moment of life was a small rebellion against the inevitable, a victory worth celebrating even if it didn't last. In quieter hours, he would sit outside his hut and watch the river. It was his teacher, his constant reminder that everything flows: time, water, suffering. The Nile gave life and took it back without discrimination, and perhaps that was the truest kind of fairness. It didn't judge, it simply moved forward. The healer sometimes wondered if that was the secret to peace, to flow, not to fight. He'd seen men crumble from resisting what they could not control: disease, betrayal, the cruelty of chance. And yet, he'd also seen strength bloom from acceptance. Maybe wisdom wasn't about knowing how to live forever, but about knowing how to live gracefully before you don't. He treated the sick with a calm that unnerved people, Panic, he said, was contagious, and faith was the only antidote strong enough to stop it. He used humor as a shield, too. Once, when a patient asked if he could guarantee survival, he grinned and said, "I'm not even sure I'll survive today, but let's both pretend." The patient laughed through his pain, and the healer winked, because sometimes laughter was as powerful as any medicine. He'd noticed that people who laughed tended to heal faster, or at least suffer better. And in a world where nobody escapes suffering, that was a skill worth teaching. His apprentices adored him for his calmness, but envied him for his certainty. They asked him once if he still believed in the gods after all he had seen. He replied, "Belief is like breath. You don't think about it until it's gone." Then, after a pause, he added, "But unlike breath, you can choose to share it." They didn't understand at first, but years later they would. Faith wasn't about worship. It was about passing courage from one trembling hand to another. Every healer, every mother, every friend who whispered, "You'll be okay," was practicing the oldest form of divinity. There were times, though, when even his strength wavered. During plagues, when the temples filled with coughing bodies and the air stank of death, he would find himself questioning everything. The gods, the herbs, even the purpose of compassion. He'd bury one patient and rush to save another, the cycle repeating endlessly until exhaustion became his second skin. He began to dream of the dead, faces he couldn't name, calling his name from the river. He'd wake drenched in sweat, unsure if he was still among the living. But even then, he rose before dawn and went back to work. Because in Egypt, where eternity was the goal of every soul, to keep someone breathing another day was a sacred act. It meant you had cheated the universe, if only briefly. As his fame grew, people began to call him the one who speaks to death. He laughed at the title, calling it bad advertising. If I truly spoke to death, he'd say, I'd tell it to take a holiday. Still, the nickname stuck, and it followed him into old age. He had students now, young healers with soft hands and sharper ambition. They came to him for knowledge, but he tried to give them something rarer, perspective. Healing, he told them, isn't about pretending to be a god. It's about remembering you're not. He taught them that every cure was temporary, every success fragile, and that this fragility was what made their work beautiful. One of his apprentices once asked what he feared most. The healer smiled faintly. Forgetting, he said. Not death, not pain, forgetting what it means to care. He'd seen healers who grew so skilled they stopped feeling, doctors who measured life in successes instead of stories. To him, the moment you stopped seeing a patient as a person, you stopped being a healer. He believed that medicine without empathy was just well-organized cruelty, and that thought haunted him more than the dead ever could. In his final years, his hands began to tremble too much for surgery. He spent more time teaching, less time cutting, but he didn't mind. He knew that his hands were only the tools. The real healing had always come from the heart. Sometimes he'd walk along the riverbank and smile at the irony of it all. He had spent his life trying to preserve what was never meant to last. But maybe that was the point, to keep reaching, keep mending, keep loving, even when you know everything you touch will one day return to dust. There's a strange kind of peace in that, a peace born not from victory, but from surrender. And on his last night, when the air grew still and the world seemed to pause, he lay in his cot, surrounded by his apprentices. He could hear the river beyond the walls, murmuring softly, as if welcoming him home. He looked at his students, young faces lit by lamplight, and smiled. "Remember," he whispered, "the body is only a story. What matters is how you tell it." Then he closed his eyes, exhaled once, and joined the silence. The apprentices didn't cry at first. They just sat there, listening, as if waiting for the river to speak again. And in a way it did, because the Nile never stopped flowing, just as healing never stopped moving from one generation to the next. The healer was gone, but his work lived on, in laughter and compassion in every pair of trembling hands that dared to believe they could hold back the tide of time, even for a moment. The desert had a peculiar way of keeping secrets. It buried them under layers of sand and silence, waiting for someone patient enough, or foolish enough, to listen. Centuries later, archaeologists would stumble upon jars, scalpels, and faded scrolls, and they'd call them relics. But to the people who once used them, they weren't artifacts. They were lifelines. The healer's hut might be gone, his name erased by time, but his hands still lived on through the fragments he left behind. A bronze knife dulled by use, a papyrus covered in cramped handwriting, a faint smear of something that was once blood, now dust. These weren't the remains of superstition. They were the fingerprints of humanity's first defiance against despair. It's strange to think that thousands of years ago, a man stood in that same sand and pondered the same questions we still do. Why do we suffer, and what does it mean to be whole? The tools were simpler then, but the questions were just as complex. The Egyptians didn't separate the physical from the spiritual because they knew, instinctively, that the body and the soul shared the same skin. When someone fell ill, it wasn't just the flesh that was out of balance. It was the universe inside them. Healing wasn't about domination. It was about negotiation. They didn't cure. They restored. And maybe that's what made their medicine feel timeless. They understood that everything had rhythm. The river had its flood and its drought. The heart had its pulse and its pause. Even pain had its own pattern, a strange music that echoed through the body. The healer's job was to listen for the discord, the note that had gone wrong, and bring it back into harmony. It wasn't an exact science, but perhaps that's what made it work. They didn't chase perfection, they chased balance. And maybe we could learn from that. Today we diagnose, medicate, and move on, but the Egyptians lingered. They looked at illness the way a poet looks at sorrow, not as an interruption, but as an invitation to understand something deeper. Some of their remedies sound absurd now, crocodile dung, burnt hedgehogs, or pigeon soup for headaches, but behind each concoction was the same stubborn hope, that the earth held an answer, if only one had the courage to look for it. And in a way they weren't wrong. Modern medicine owes more to them than we like to admit. Their use of honey to disinfect wounds, their understanding of the pulse, their emphasis on hygiene, they were small revolutions hidden in the folds of ritual. The irony is that while they thought they were invoking gods, they were actually discovering biology. Maybe that's the real joke of history. Divine inspiration and trial and error often look suspiciously alike. The healer's spirit, if one could still call it that, seemed to linger in every practice that followed. Even in the antiseptic corridors of modern hospitals, with their beeping machines and sterile air, a faint echo of those ancient rituals remains. Every doctor who reassures a frightened patient, every nurse who adjusts a pillow, every researcher who whispers, "just one more trial before dawn," they're all speaking the same ancient language. They're saying, "I see your pain, and I will not look away." It's a language that predates science and survives skepticism. Because healing, at its core, is not about certainty, it's about care. Sometimes, when people romanticize ancient Egypt, they imagine grandeur, pyramids, gold, gods with falcon heads. But the true magic was quieter. It lived in moments of human connection. The mother who stayed awake by her child's bedside, whispering prayers. The apprentice who risked punishment to save a stranger. The healer who, despite exhaustion, still believed one more dose of honey and faith might be enough. They didn't call it compassion. They called it duty. And in that simplicity lies something profound. Modern life often confuses kindness for weakness, but in Egypt, it was the highest strength. They believed that to heal another was to participate in creation itself. There's something darkly humorous about it, too. Imagine the healer, covered in sweat, mixing herbs while being watched by a statue of a god with the head of an ibis, hoping he doesn't sneeze at the wrong moment and ruin the mixture. He probably didn't think of himself as wise or holy. More likely, he thought, if this works, I'll finally get some sleep. Yet it's precisely that blend of exhaustion, humility, and persistence that made him remarkable. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing relief, both his and others. That, perhaps, is the most human instinct of all. As centuries passed, their methods evolved, but their philosophy endured. The Greeks borrowed their knowledge, the Romans refined it, and somewhere along the way, medicine lost its poetry. Healing became a transaction, and patients became cases. The healer would have found it amusing, the idea that one could treat a body without treating the person who lived inside it. He knew that pain wasn't just an inconvenience. It was communication. It was the body's way of saying, something needs your attention. Stab. And ignoring it was like ignoring the gods themselves. Dangerous, foolish, and eventually fatal. Even now, the echo of his work can be felt in places we least expect it. In rural villages where herbalists still crush leaves between stones. In hospitals where nurses still hum songs to calm frightened children. In the whispered prayers muttered by surgeons before complicated procedures, even if they don't believe in any deity at all. It's as if the healer's legacy transcended religion, weaving itself into the DNA of compassion. Maybe the gods he once served never really existed, but the faith he practiced, the faith in care and resilience, that still does. The desert wind carried more than sand. It carried memory. Long after the last temple crumbled, people still came to the ruins to ask for blessings. They left offerings, bread, flowers, bits of cloth, hoping that the spirit of those old healers still lingered. Perhaps it did. Perhaps healing, once begun, never truly ends. It flows forward like the Nile, changing shape but never losing its essence. It starts with one act of mercy and ripples outward through time, touching people who will never know its origin. If the healer could see us now, he might laugh at our machines and marvel at our medicines, but he would recognize the look in our eyes, the same mix of fear and hope, the same trembling faith in the face of the unknown. He'd understand that, for all our progress, we're still asking the same questions, still lighting lamps in the dark, still daring to believe that every wound can be mended. And maybe he'd say what he always said when he finished a long night's work, as the first light of morning crept across the sand. The gods are quiet now, but that's all right. It's our turn to speak. And in that quiet, endless dawn, somewhere between life and legend, the healer's story continues. Not in scrolls or temples, but in every hand that reaches out to help, every heart that chooses compassion over indifference. Because in the end, healing was never about defeating death. It was about honoring life again and again, even when it slips through our fingers like sand, and laughing softly at the miracle of how much we still care. The desert didn't sleep. It shifted and whispered under the moonlight, the sand moving like a memory too restless to settle. Somewhere near the edge of the Nile, where the reeds swayed and frogs croaked in their nightly chorus, the faint glow of a single oil lamp pulsed in the dark. Inside that flickering light, a healer sat hunched over a small clay table surrounded by jars and scrolls, his hands stained with herbs and ash. He was old now, older than he liked to admit, but his mind still burned with the same quiet fire that had guided him since his youth. His fingers trembled, but not from weakness. It was the trembling of someone who understood that knowledge is never fully owned, only borrowed, and that wisdom often arrives too late to save the people who need it most. The night was heavy, humid, and full of life. Insects buzzed lazily around the flame as he ground a mixture of honey, myrrh, and poppy into a thick paste. He smiled faintly, remembering how once, as a young apprentice, he'd made the same mixture but forgotten the poppy. The patient had survived, but only because he fainted from pain and everyone assumed he'd died and come back. The healer laughed softly at the thought. Pain, he realized long ago, had its own sense of humor. It waited for pride to arrive before striking, and it never missed its cue. Maybe the gods were comedians and medicine was their favorite punchline. He often wondered how much of what he did was truly healing, and how much was comfort disguised as cure. When he cleaned a wound or soothed a cough, he wasn't just fighting disease, he was fighting fear. Fear, he'd come to believe, was the oldest sickness of all, one that no herb could cure and no prayer could fully silence. Sometimes he thought that half his job was simply convincing people that they weren't already dying. Hope, after all, was a medicine far more potent than anything he could mix in a jar. It didn't stop the bleeding, but it stopped the despair, and in most cases, that was enough to keep someone alive another day. One of his apprentices, a bright but impulsive boy named Menace, once asked him why he never bragged about his miracles. "Because they're not mine," he'd said, stirring a pot of salve without looking up. "If they live, it's because the gods were kind. If they die, it's because I was too slow. Either way, bragging makes me look foolish." Menace had frowned, unsatisfied. "But surely you've done great things?" The healer had smiled, the kind of tired smile only old men know. "Yes," he said, "I failed less than most. That's as great as it gets." Despite his humility, people whispered legends about him. Some claimed he'd cured blindness by washing eyes with tears from the Nile. Others swore he could pull fever from a child's body just by laying his hands upon their chest. He knew the truth was simpler and, in some ways, more miraculous. His cures worked because people believed they could. Faith made their bodies cooperate, made their minds release their grip on pain. The Egyptians were right about one thing. Spirit and flesh were never separate. Treat one, and you touch the other. It's why he always spoke gently when treating the sick. Words he knew could heal or harm just as easily as knives. He was fascinated by how fragile the human body was, and yet how determined it remained to keep going. A man could break a rib, lose a limb, be scorched by the desert sun, and still find the will to stand. There was something absurdly inspiring about that. Once, he treated a farmer who had been bitten by a cobra. The man looked him straight in the eye, said, "Tell my wife I love her," and then, inexplicably, asked for one last sip of beer. The healer gave it to him, certain it would be the man's final request. But hours later, the farmer was sitting upright, asking for another drink. "The gods must be drunk too," the healer had muttered, shaking his head. Life, it seemed, had a tendency to misbehave. As the years passed, he began to see medicine not as a science, but as a story told by the body, edited by the healer, and rewritten by time. Every scar was a sentence, every wrinkle a paragraph. The body remembered everything, even what the mind tried to forget. He'd seen men with perfect health crumble under guilt, and dying women smile as if death itself were nothing more than a change of scenery. Healing, he realized, wasn't about defeating illness. It was about teaching people how to live with it. In that sense, everyone was both patient and physician, constantly treating their own unseen wounds. Sometimes, when he walked along the riverbank at dusk, he thought about the ones he couldn't save. Their names followed him like echoes, soft but insistent. He wondered if they blamed him, wherever they were. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they understood what he now did, that medicine is less about control and more about surrender. You fight as long as you can, then you let go. It wasn't defeat, it was trust. The healer used to envy the priests for their certainty in the afterlife, but now he found peace in the not knowing. Perhaps mystery itself was the true cure for fear, the acceptance that some things are meant to remain unsolved. He wasn't without humor about it all. If the gods wanted us perfect, he'd joke, they would have made us out of stone. But no, they chose mud and gave us bones that break and stomachs that complain after one bad meal. Maybe they just wanted to see what we'd do with it. His apprentices laughed, but there was truth in the jest. The fragility of the human body was its greatest weakness and its greatest strength. It demanded care, demanded connection. Every illness reminded people how much they needed one another. Perhaps that was the real purpose of sickness, to make the living remember they were never meant to survive alone. When he grew too old to treat patients, he spent his days teaching, passing down the knowledge etched into his memory like hieroglyphs on temple walls. He taught not just the techniques, but the temperament. Be patient with pain, he'd tell them. It's the body's way of asking for understanding. He taught them that medicine without compassion was useless, that herbs without empathy were just leaves. And most of all, he taught them to listen, to the body, to the silence, to the spaces between breaths. Healing, he said, often happened there, in the pauses where logic could not reach. In his final days, the healer's sight began to fade, but his mind remained sharp. He often sat by the window, watching the last light of the day reflect on the river. It looked to him like liquid gold, endless and eternal. He wondered if that was what the afterlife truly was. Not paradise, not punishment, but continuity. The same river, flowing through different worlds. He found comfort in that thought. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air filled with the hum of crickets, he whispered a prayer, not to any god in particular, but to the spirit of life itself. "Thank you," he said softly, "for letting me mend what I could and forgive what I couldn't." When morning came, his apprentices found him sitting upright, eyes closed, the faintest smile on his lips. Outside, the Nile flowed on, indifferent yet eternal. Birds rose in slow spirals above the water, and the first light touched the jars and scrolls in his hut, painting them gold. His students wept, but there was peace in their tears. They buried him by the river, as he'd requested, where the air smelled of herbs and the soil remembered every drop of healing ever spilled upon it. And though the man was gone, his story lingered, woven into every whispered prayer, every trembling hand that reached to ease another's pain, because in the end, the healer had been right all along. Death was not the end of healing. It was simply its most silent form. The sun rose slow and deliberate over the desert, a molten disk turning the horizon into liquid fire. The Nile shimmered like a silver serpent in the distance, winding lazily between fields of barley and papyrus. In the soft hush of dawn, the world seemed to hold its breath. Inside a small mud-brick house near the edge of Thebes, a young apprentice knelt before a worn wooden box. Inside it were the tools of his late master, scalpels dulled by time, bandages stiff with age, tiny jars still smelling faintly of honey and resin. He touched them carefully, as though the objects themselves might still remember the warmth of the old healer's hands. He'd promised to continue the work, though he wasn't sure what that really meant. The world around him was changing. New rulers, new gods, new medicines whispered in foreign tongues. Yet somehow the lessons of his master still echoed louder than any decree. Healing wasn't just a skill, it was a covenant, a conversation between suffering and compassion. And if that conversation ever stopped, something sacred in the world would fall silent. He thought of how his teacher used to say, "We don't fix people. We remind them that they were never broken, only out of tune." At the time, he'd laughed. Now it sounded less like poetry and more like a truth too fragile to speak aloud. As he prepared his workspace, a woman entered carrying her child, a boy no older than 6, his face pale, his breath shallow. The apprentice felt a jolt of fear. There was no one else to turn to now. The old healer was gone, and the gods, as usual, were busy with their own affairs. He cleaned the boy's forehead with wine, the sting waking him just enough to groan. The apprentice whispered soothing words he didn't fully believe. He made a poultice, muttered the same prayers his master once did, and watched the boy's chest rise and fall like a fragile wave. In that moment, he realized that healing had never been about certainty. It was about courage, the courage to stand in the space between hope and despair and keep trying anyway. Hours passed. The boy began to breathe easier. The mother wept and called it a miracle. The apprentice smiled but didn't answer. He knew the truth. Miracles weren't gifts from gods. They were the quiet result of care, persistence, and just enough ignorance to keep trying when reason said to stop. It was strange, really. The more he practiced, the more he realized medicine was less about mastery and more about humility. The body was an endless mystery, and every cure only revealed a dozen new questions. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the gods had designed humans this way so they'd never grow bored. After all, if everything could be healed, there'd be no reason to stay kind. That night, he sat by the river, watching the stars ripple in its reflection. He remembered how his master once said that healing was a kind of rebellion, against decay, against chaos, against the indifference of the universe, and sitting there he understood. Every bandage wrapped, every wound cleaned, every fever soothed, it was all an act of quiet defiance. The Egyptians built temples to honor gods, but healers built theirs in moments. A hand on a trembling shoulder, a whispered reassurance, a shared silence. These were their offerings, their altars. And unlike stone, compassion didn't erode. It traveled, invisible and immortal, carried in the stories people told about those who cared for them. In the markets of Thebes, healing had become a strange performance. Herbalists shouted promises of instant cures. Priests waved amulets like keys to salvation, and merchants sold miracle oils at prices fit for royalty. The apprentice walked among them half amused, half disgusted. Humanity, he thought, never changes. When fear rises, reason retreats, and charlatans thrive. He watched as a man claimed his ointment could ward off the spirits of death. The crowd bought every jar. The apprentice shook his head. His master would have laughed at the absurdity of it, then quietly healed the same people later without charging a single coin. Still, he couldn't deny that there was something oddly beautiful about the chaos. For all their foolishness, people clung to hope with both hands, refusing to surrender to despair. And wasn't that the essence of life itself? The refusal to give up, no matter how ridiculous the odds? He thought of the old stories, of priests who cured blindness with tears, of women who healed fevers by singing, of gods who bled for the sake of humankind. Maybe none of it was literal, but all of it was true. Because healing wasn't just a physical act. It was a declaration that life was worth the effort. He began teaching children from the village, just as his master had taught him. He showed them how to recognize herbs by their smell, how to feel the pulse, how to listen, not just to the heartbeat, but to the quiet panic behind it. The body speaks, he told them, but it doesn't use words. The children laughed, but he smiled knowingly. He knew that one day they'd understand, that medicine was less about the hands and more about the heart. You could learn anatomy in a month, but compassion took a lifetime. One afternoon, he was summoned to the home of a dying priest. The man's wealth was obvious: golden amulets, fine linens, the faint smell of incense clinging to the walls. The priest demanded to be cured. "You will not let me die," he said, eyes wide with the panic of those who thought themselves immortal. The apprentice examined him, saw the grayness of his skin, the shallow flicker of his breath, and knew the truth. "I can ease your pain," he said softly, "but death is not an illness, it's a return." The priest cursed him, offering gold, threats, prayers, anything but acceptance. The apprentice stayed until the man's last breath, holding his hand, whispering calm into the room. Later, as he left, he realized that sometimes the greatest act of healing is simply helping someone die without fear. The seasons turned. The Nile flooded and receded, the cycle repeating as it always had. The apprentice grew older, though he never noticed when the word apprentice stopped fitting him. One day, a young woman came to his door with her own apprentice trailing behind her, clutching a bundle of herbs. She asked for guidance, and he found himself speaking with his master's voice. The realization made him laugh. "So this," he said, "is immortality." Why? Knowledge, after all, didn't live in temples or tombs. It lived in hands that remembered, in stories retold, in kindness repeated. As night fell, he sat once more by the river, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and the hum of insects. The water reflected the stars like scattered fire. He thought about how many lives had come and gone since his teacher's death, how many healers had risen, fallen, and been forgotten. And yet, the act of healing endured. It was older than pyramids, older than kings, older even than gods. It belonged not to time, but to the human spirit. He dipped his fingers into the cool water and smiled. The Nile flowed endlessly, carrying silt, memory, and faith. Maybe that was what healing truly was, a river that never stopped, reshaping everything it touched. Somewhere in the distance, laughter echoed. A woman calling her child, a man singing to the rhythm of his oar. Life, in all its fragile stubbornness, went on. The healer closed his eyes and listened, feeling a quiet gratitude rise within him. He realized then that medicine, at its heart, was not about defying death or even saving lives. It was about bearing witness to the miracle of existence, to stand in awe of its beauty, its cruelty, its humor, and still say, yes, it's worth it. And with that thought, as the river murmured and the stars burned above, he felt the same peace his master once did, the peace that comes not from certainty, but from devotion to the impossible act of keeping life alive, one heartbeat at a time. The evening wind rolled gently through the reeds, carrying with it the scent of the Nile, mud, papyrus, and something ancient that lingered beyond time. The healer stood by the water's edge, his reflection trembling with every ripple. He wasn't young anymore, though the years had been kind to him. His hair, once black as obsidian, now shimmered like the sands of dawn, and his eyes had that rare quality of people who have seen too much, yet still choose kindness. The world around him had changed. New rulers, new gods, new medicines that promised more and delivered less. But in his heart, the old truths remained untouched. He had learned that progress could polish the surface of life, but the essence of healing, empathy, patience, and courage, was as timeless as the river itself. He often thought about how much people misunderstood medicine. They saw it as a battle, as if every sickness were an enemy and every cure a victory. But he had stopped thinking in terms of winning and losing long ago. Life wasn't a war to be won. It was a garden to be tended, constantly growing and decaying, beautiful in both its bloom and its rot. The best healers, he believed, weren't warriors. They were gardeners, patient and observant, pruning, watering, waiting. The body had its own seasons, its own language, and most of the time, all it needed was to be listened to. One morning, a young soldier came to him, his arm broken from battle. He sat silently as the healer cleaned the wound, his face pale and angry. "Will I fight again?" the soldier asked. The healer smiled faintly. "Do you want to?" The soldier looked confused, as if no one had ever asked him that before. He expected a promise of recovery, not a question of purpose. The healer wrapped the bandage carefully, saying, "The body always finds a way to heal. The question is whether the heart will let it." Later, when the soldier returned to thank him, he wasn't carrying a sword, but a walking stick. He'd chosen to leave the army and tend fields instead. The healer found that far more heroic. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the hardest wounds weren't visible. Once, a noblewoman came to him, claiming she couldn't sleep. She'd tried every potion, every charm, every prayer. He asked her about her days, her fears, her dreams. Eventually, she confessed that she wasn't haunted by sickness, but by guilt. Her family had grown rich through the suffering of others, and no amount of wealth could buy her peace. The healer didn't give her medicine that day. He gave her a task: to feed the hungry. "Cure the hunger of others," he said, "and perhaps the gods will cure the hunger of your soul." Weeks later, she returned, exhausted but smiling. For the first time in years, she said, she had slept through the night. He had no herbs to credit for that, only compassion, the most underestimated remedy of all. At times, he found humor in humanity's constant search for shortcuts. People wanted the gods to fix what they refused to change themselves. They prayed for health, but feasted like kings. They begged for peace, but nurtured envy. They wanted youth, but never gratitude. Once, a merchant asked for a potion to make him live forever. The healer laughed so hard he nearly dropped his pestle. "You can't even live today properly," he said, "and you want forever?" The merchant left offended, but the healer didn't regret it. Perhaps truth was the only medicine that worked instantly, and like all strong doses, it stung. As the years unfolded, his fame spread far beyond his village. People traveled for days just to hear his words, even if he did little more than listen. Some brought gold, others brought stories, and he found both equally valuable. He never refused anyone, not even the ones he knew he couldn't save. A healer's duty, he'd once said, is not only to prolong life, but to soften it. To him, comfort was as sacred as cure. If a dying man left this world with less fear than he came with, that too was healing. He spent his evenings teaching his apprentices not only about herbs and anatomy, but about silence. "Learn to shut up," he told them with a grin. "Half of healing is knowing when not to speak." They laughed, thinking it a joke, until they treated their first patients. Only then did they understand that silence could be medicine, that words could bruise as easily as knives, and sometimes a quiet nod meant more than 100 reassurances. In that stillness, something profound happened. The patient began to heal themselves. One night, as a storm rolled over the desert, lightning flashing like the anger of forgotten gods, the healer sat by his lamp and reread old scrolls. Many of the remedies seemed outdated now. Recipes for snake bites and plagues written in ink long faded. He smiled, realizing how much he had once believed in certainty, how much he had trusted that knowledge alone could save people. But life had taught him a crueler and wiser truth. You could know everything and still fail. Healing wasn't about perfection, it was about presence. People didn't remember the medicine. They remembered the hands that held them, the eyes that didn't flinch when they were at their weakest. Sometimes he wondered what the future would think of them. Would distant generations laugh at their ignorance? Probably. Would they recognize the same fears, the same hunger for meaning? Absolutely. He liked to imagine a doctor, centuries from now, standing in a bright, sterile room, holding a machine that could do in seconds what took him hours, and yet feeling the same quiet tremor in the heart when faced with suffering. Progress, he thought, might change the tools, but not the task. The essence of healing, the courage to care in a world that doesn't guarantee reward, would remain the same. As the night deepened, he walked outside, his feet sinking into the cool sand. The moon was high, its reflection trembling on the river's surface. He thought of all the lives he had touched and all the lives he hadn't. The ones he'd saved, the ones he'd lost, the ones who had come only to talk. They blended together like grains of sand in the same eternal wind. And it struck him, with quiet wonder, that maybe that was the point. Healing was never about permanence. It was about the moment, the breath between pain and peace, the spark that said, "Not yet." He chuckled softly to himself, remembering how his master used to say that the universe was just one big hospital, and we were all both doctors and patients. "If you live long enough," he used to joke, "you'll eventually end up treating the people who once treated you," and realizing they were improvising the whole time. The healer couldn't disagree. Life, it seemed, was an endless cycle of trial and error, failure and forgiveness. Maybe that was what made it beautiful. When dawn finally began to break, painting the world in shades of gold and rose, he felt no urgency to move. The first call of a bird echoed over the river, and the light caught the surface like fire dancing on glass. He took a deep breath and smiled, feeling the same peace his teacher must have felt before him. He knew his days were numbered, but the thought didn't frighten him. The river would keep flowing, the apprentices would keep learning, and somewhere a new healer would rise and look upon the same horizon. asking the same timeless question: how do we heal what we cannot fix? And in that endless asking, in the trying, the failing, the laughing, the forgiving, life would continue to heal itself, one heartbeat at a time. Because in the end, that was the greatest secret the Egyptians ever discovered, that the art of medicine was not about conquering death, but about learning to live gracefully within its shadow, finding joy in the absurdity of existence and daring, always, to care anyway. The desert stretched endlessly before him, a vast ocean of silence where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The healer walked slowly now, his steps measured, each one sinking softly into the golden dust that had swallowed centuries. He carried no staff, no satchel of herbs, just a small clay amulet hanging around his neck, its surface smooth from years of wear. It wasn't power he carried, but memory. The memory of hands healed and lost, of laughter and grief woven together like linen fibers. He had long since accepted that all healers eventually turn into their own final patient. The irony wasn't lost on him. It never was. Life, he thought, had an impeccable sense of humor. He often wondered what his master would say if he could see him now. Probably something infuriatingly simple, like, keep your hands steady and your heart soft. That was the trouble with wisdom. It always sounded too easy. The real work was in living it. He smiled at the thought, remembering how stubborn he'd been as a student, demanding formulas and recipes when what he needed was patience. The young always wanted shortcuts, but wisdom, like fermentation, needed time, and sometimes a little heat. The air shimmered with the scent of cumin and myrrh from the nearby market. He stopped by a stall where an old woman sold herbs. Her hands were twisted like the roots she sorted through, but her eyes were sharp, alive. "You're the healer from Thebes," she said without looking up. He nodded. "Not anymore," he replied. She chuckled. "No one stops being a healer. You just stop charging for it." He laughed. She wasn't wrong. Healing was never a profession, not really. It was a calling that didn't retire. Even now, when his hands trembled too much to tie bandages, his mind still reached for remedies every time someone coughed nearby. He bought a handful of dried lotus petals from her and slipped them into his pocket. Not because he needed them, but because old habits die harder than old men. He wandered toward the edge of the city, where the fields kissed the river. Children were bathing in the water, laughing as they splashed each other. Their joy was loud and pure, a sound untouched by fear or logic. It reminded him of his first patients, how much faith they had, how they believed that a touch, a word, or a prayer could change everything. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't, but maybe the belief itself was part of the cure. The body, he'd come to realize, listens closely to what the mind whispers. If the mind says, "we are dying," the body obeys. If it says, "we are healing," the body tries. Perhaps that was why laughter worked better than most medicines. He sat beneath a palm tree, watching the ripples in the water, and thought about all the ways people sought to escape pain. In his youth, he'd tried to fight it, to wrestle it into submission. But now he saw pain differently, not as an enemy, but as a teacher with poor bedside manners. It arrived uninvited, made you uncomfortable, and left you wiser if you were lucky enough to survive its lessons. He once told a patient, "Pain isn't cruelty, it's communication. The body speaks through it. The question is whether we're willing to listen." The man hadn't liked that answer. Few people did. Everyone wanted relief, not reflection. Yet, he thought, the two were often the same. As the day grew hotter, he closed his eyes and listened to the hum of life around him. Somewhere nearby, a farmer cursed at his ox. A woman sang while pounding grain. The world was a symphony of ordinary miracles. And he realized how much healing happened without his help. The body healed cuts, rivers healed banks, even grief softened with time. Perhaps his role had never been to fix anything, but simply to remind people that they were designed to heal, to show them that they weren't broken, just becoming. He remembered once visiting a temple physician who boasted that he could conquer disease. The phrase had made him laugh out loud. "Conquer?" he'd said. "You can't conquer something that lives inside you?" The man had frowned, offended, but the healer meant it sincerely. Illness, he believed, wasn't an invader. It was a message. And messages shouldn't be fought, they should be read. Modern minds would probably call that philosophy, but to him it was just common sense. The body wasn't a battlefield, it was a garden. If weeds grew, you didn't go to war, you tended better. A breeze stirred, carrying the scent of lotus blossoms from the river. He thought of the people he had treated, the mothers who clutched their children through fevered nights, the soldiers who came to him with wounds both visible and unseen, the old men who feared dying, and the young ones who didn't think they could. They were all stories, he realized, and somehow he had become their archivist. Healing was never just about flesh. It was about preserving stories, giving pain a place to rest so that life could continue. And maybe, when people died, what truly left wasn't their body, but their story moving on to another chapter. Sometimes he found humor in the absurdity of it all. People prayed to gods for immortality while ignoring the simple truth that they were already part of something eternal. He once joked to an apprentice, "We're all just temporary shapes in the same eternal clay." Some of us crack earlier, that's all. And the apprentice had laughed nervously, not sure whether it was wisdom or blasphemy. But the healer didn't care. He had learned that sacredness wasn't in temples or rituals. It was in the tiny, ridiculous persistence of being alive. The sun began to dip, and the light turned soft, gilding everything in honey. He walked back toward the city, passing murals of gods with falcon heads and cow horns, their eyes eternally watching. He couldn't help but smirk. If those gods really were watching, he thought, they must have grown quite bored by now. Humanity, after all, never changed much, still falling in love, still fearing death, still pretending to understand the meaning of it all. He suspected the gods didn't interfere because they were waiting to see if humans would ever figure it out themselves. And perhaps, in some cosmic way, healing was part of that experiment, the universe's way of teaching empathy, one wound at a time. When he reached his home, the stars had begun to appear, scattered across the sky like salt on black marble. He lit his oil lamp and sat beside it, tracing the cracks on the wall with his eyes. Each crack reminded him of something, someone he had helped, someone he had lost, someone who had helped him. He realized with a gentle ache that his life had been nothing more than a series of exchanges, pain for compassion, sorrow for understanding, endings for beginnings. That was the rhythm of existence, the great heartbeat of the world. He took a deep breath and smiled, the flame flickering in his eyes. Somewhere outside, a child laughed and a dog barked and the river whispered like a lullaby. He thought of all the healers who had come before him and all those yet to come. They would carry the same burdens, make the same mistakes, and find the same quiet joy in helping others. And maybe, long after his name was forgotten, his spirit would live in their hands, their laughter, their stubborn refusal to stop caring. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the sounds of the night wash over him. The lamp burned low, but the room felt brighter somehow. He understood now that healing was never a destination. It was a motion, a rhythm, a pulse that moved through generations. It wasn't about stopping death or even easing pain. It was about bearing witness to life in all its fragile, ridiculous glory. He laughed softly to himself, whispering to the empty room, "The gods must be amused. They gave us hearts that break just so we'd have a reason to love." And with that thought, the healer finally rested, not in defeat, but in harmony, as the night embraced the world and the river kept whispering, carrying the memory of every heartbeat it had ever heard. The night was cool and strangely alive, the kind of Egyptian night that seemed to breathe with its own slow rhythm. The healer's house sat near the edge of the village, its walls faintly glowing from the oil lamp inside. From a distance, it looked almost like a shrine, small, quiet, and pulsing with an invisible gravity that pulled people toward it. And they came, as they always did, carrying fevers, bruises, and secrets too heavy to confess anywhere else. He wasn't just the man who treated illness, he was the one who held space for everything the world didn't know what to do with. In a way, he was less a doctor and more a listener disguised as one. Inside, he sat on a woven mat, hands resting on his knees, eyes half closed. He wasn't sleeping, he was waiting. There was an art to waiting that he'd learned over a lifetime, the kind of patience that no teacher could explain. Waiting, he often said, was the most underrated form of medicine. People feared silence, but he'd found that if you sat still long enough, the truth always spoke first. Sometimes it whispered through trembling lips, sometimes through a body's pain, but it always spoke. He'd learned to listen, not just with his ears, but with his bones. A knock came softly on the door. A young girl entered, her mother following close behind. The child's arm was wrapped in linen, stained dark with blood. The mother's face was tense, the kind of fear that comes not from pain, but from love. The healer gestured for them to sit. He removed the bandage gently, revealing a deep cut. "It's not the gods who make us bleed," he murmured, "but perhaps they teach us how to stop it." He cleaned the wound, the girl wincing at the sting. "Breathe," he told her. "Pain is just your body shouting that it's still alive." The girl laughed to spite herself, and he smiled. "See? It's not so bad. Even pain gets tired if you don't run from it." When the wound was wrapped again, the mother thanked him through tears. "It's not me you should thank," he said, handing her a jar of honey salve. "Thank the bees. They work harder than I ever will." She laughed, and for a moment the fear left her face. That, he thought, was the real medicine, when people left lighter than when they came in. Healing wasn't a cure. It was a kind of remembering that even in pain, life kept moving, stubborn and beautiful. He often joked that the gods must have been comedians because the human body was their longest-running joke. They gave us joints that ache, bones that snap, and a stomach that betrays us the moment we smell spoiled food, he'd say. If immortality was the plan, they really messed up the blueprint. But behind the humor was awe. The body was miraculous precisely because it was flawed. It broke, but it also mended. It decayed, but it also created life. Maybe the gods had made humans imperfect so they'd learn to rely on one another. After all, if we could fix ourselves completely, we'd never need compassion. And that would be the real tragedy. Sometimes he marveled at how healing mirrored the Nile. It could be gentle or violent, calm or chaotic, but it always found a way forward. The river flooded every year, destroying crops only to make the soil fertile again. Pain, he realized, worked the same way. It washed over a person, tearing away what no longer served, leaving behind the possibility of new growth. He'd seen it too many times to doubt it. A grieving widow who found purpose in caring for orphans. A blind man who became a storyteller, weaving worlds from sound. Even his own loneliness had taught him tenderness. Suffering, for all its cruelty, was often a midwife for wisdom. The healer was no stranger to loneliness. He'd never married, never stayed long enough in one place to build the kind of roots others took for granted. Some said he was married to his craft. Others whispered that the gods had claimed his heart as payment for his gift. The truth was simpler. He had loved once, deeply, and lost her to illness. He'd tried every remedy he knew, even the forbidden ones whispered by temple priests. But nothing worked. When she died, he buried not only her body, but his certainty. He'd spent years trying to understand how a man who could save others could fail the one person who mattered most. It was only later, when grief softened into acceptance, that he understood. He hadn't failed to heal her. He'd simply been given a different kind of healing, one that taught him humility, one that taught him to see beauty even in the ending of things. He never spoke of her to anyone, but sometimes, when the night was quiet, he swore he could hear her laughter in the rustling of the reeds by the river. It wasn't sadness that visited him then, but gratitude. Pain, he realized, never truly disappeared. It just changed its shape until it fit comfortably inside you. Perhaps that was its final mercy. It never left you empty, only wiser. As the years passed, people began calling him the keeper of the pulse. They said he could feel a heartbeat and know a person's truth. He never corrected them, though he found the title amusing. "I'm no keeper," he'd mutter. "I just listen to what's already there." But in a way it was fitting. The pulse was the first song every human carried, a reminder that life began with rhythm, not reason. He'd often tell his apprentices, "When you listen to the pulse, you're not just hearing the heart. You're hearing the history of every moment that kept it beating." One evening, a traveler came seeking counsel. He wasn't sick, just weary. He confessed that he'd lost faith in everything, his work, his family, even the gods. "You heal bodies," the traveler said. "Can you heal faith?" The healer smiled. "Faith doesn't die," he replied. "It just gets tired and sits down for a while. You have to offer it water and let it rest. It'll stand again when it's ready." The traveler laughed, though his eyes filled with tears. "You sound like my grandfather," he said. "Then he must have been a wise man," the healer replied, "or at least a tired one. He liked to remind people that wisdom wasn't born from brilliance, but from blunders. A man who never errs, he'd say, is either lying or hasn't lived long enough." That always drew chuckles, but it was true. The Egyptians carved their achievements in stone, but they buried their lessons in the sand. The healer found that fitting. Wisdom, after all, was meant to be uncovered again and again, not worshipped. As the stars began to appear over the river, he leaned back, listening to the sounds of life pulsing through the night. Crickets chirped. The distant hum of voices rose from the village. Somewhere, a woman sang softly to a child. He thought about how every sound, every breath, every heartbeat was a small defiance against the silence that waited at the end. Perhaps that was the greatest secret of all. Life was not about avoiding death, but about learning to make enough noise before it arrived. He closed his eyes, a smile tugging at his lips. The air was cool, the lamp's light warm against his skin. For a moment he felt suspended between two worlds, one that still needed him and one that quietly called him home. But he wasn't afraid. He knew that healing, like the river, never truly stopped. It only changed form. Someone else would take his place, someone young, foolish, and eager as he once was. And that thought made him laugh softly. "The gods," he whispered, "they do love their little circles." And as the night deepened, his laughter drifted out through the open window, mingling with the wind and the endless whisper of the Nile, a sound that had healed the world long before men ever tried. The night was softer than usual, a thick, velvet kind of darkness that seemed to hold the stars closer to the earth. The healer sat on the bank of the Nile, his feet half buried in the cool sand, watching the moon dance across the ripples. He was old now, so old that even the river seemed young beside him. His face, carved by time and sun, carried the lines of a man who had smiled more than he'd frowned, though his eyes carried stories deep enough to drown in. It was strange, he thought, how the body aged but the mind refused to surrender. Inside, he still felt like the boy who once trembled while holding a patient's hand for the first time. Life was funny that way. It kept the heart young just long enough for the bones to complain about it. He dipped his hand into the water, letting the current slide between his fingers. The river was alive, as it had always been, humming with secrets. Somewhere downstream, crocodiles basked in the moonlight, half asleep and fully dangerous, proof that nature never really rested, it just waited. The healer had learned from the river that wisdom wasn't stillness, but flow. The moment you stopped learning, you stopped living. It was ironic, really, how people spent their lives chasing permanence when the only thing constant was change. He chuckled softly. If the gods ever offered eternal youth, he murmured to himself, I'd ask for eternal curiosity instead. He remembered the first time he'd seen a corpse, back when he was an apprentice. He'd expected horror, maybe even fear, but what struck him instead was silence, the kind that doesn't scare you, but makes you listen harder. Death, he realized, wasn't loud. It didn't roar. It sighed. It was the sound of the body letting go of what it had been carrying for too long. Since then, he'd stopped fearing it. To him, death was just a healer of a different kind, the one who arrived when all others had done their best. The final physician, he used to joke, charges no fee but takes everything. His apprentices had laughed nervously when he said that, but over time they came to understand. Humor, he always believed, was the most merciful teacher. He often thought about the way people clung to life. They feared dying but rarely understood living. They worshipped health as though it could be bottled, forgetting that even the healthiest body was only renting its time on earth. You can't outdrink mortality, he used to tell the wine merchants who came to him complaining about stomach aches. You can only toast it and hope it's in a good mood. Some of them laughed, others looked offended, but they all came back eventually. It seemed that even truth, when wrapped in laughter, was easier to swallow than medicine. He'd seen every kind of pain imaginable, physical, emotional, spiritual, the kind that left bruises and the kind that left silences. The worst he found was loneliness. No herb cured it, no prayer erased it. It was the slowest poison, spreading quietly until it hollowed a person from within. He treated it not with tinctures, but with presence. Sometimes he would sit beside a patient for hours without saying a word, letting them speak to the silence. Most healers underestimated the power of simply being there. People don't always need a cure, he would say. Sometimes they just need a witness. The healer believed deeply in stories. He collected them the way others collected charms. To him, every person was a walking manuscript, filled with pages of joy, fear, regret, and redemption. He found that listening was the truest form of medicine. Once, a fisherman came to him, certain that a curse had made his nets come up empty. After hours of talking, the healer realized the man wasn't cursed. He was grieving. His wife had died, and he'd stopped going to the river out of guilt, afraid the water would remind him of her. The curse, the healer said gently, is only that you stopped living. The fisherman wept, and days later returned to the river. When he came back with a net full of fish, he didn't thank the gods. He thanked the healer for giving him permission to feel again. He often wondered what people would remember him for. The potions, the cures, or the laughter he'd shared between doses. He hoped it would be the laughter. Medicine, after all, was temporary. Joy had longer legs. Once, during a long drought, when people were too weary to smile, he organized a feast using what little grain was left. If we're going to starve, he told them, we might as well do it together. They laughed, they danced, and somehow the rains returned days later. The villagers said it was divine mercy. He suspected it was something simpler, that joy had loosened whatever fear was holding the sky shut. There were moments when he questioned whether he'd truly made a difference. The world still suffered, diseases still came, grief still found its way into every household. Yet each time he felt doubt creeping in, he remembered a woman he'd once treated, a potter who had lost her sight in one eye. When he told her there was nothing more he could do, she smiled and said, "Then you've already done enough. You helped me see everything that still matters." That moment became his cure for doubt. He carried it like a talisman, proof that healing didn't always mean restoring. It sometimes meant revealing. The healer had outlived nearly everyone he'd loved. That was the quiet tax of kindness. It made time heavier. Some nights, when the village slept, he'd walk through the narrow alleys, feeling the weight of memories pressed against the air. The world was quieter now. The laughter that once echoed through these streets was gone, replaced by the hush of new generations who didn't yet know his name. He found comfort in that. He didn't want to be remembered as a legend. Legends turn into stories, and stories can't hold your hand. He wanted to be remembered in the way a familiar scent lingers, a faint, comforting trace that reminds people they were cared for once. He turned his gaze back to the river, its surface reflecting the moon like a mirror that refused to age. Somewhere beneath those waters, the silt carried fragments of everything, broken pottery, forgotten tools, even the ashes of the dead. And yet, the river kept flowing, cleansing itself without complaint. It reminded him of something his master once said, "The secret of life is to keep moving, even when you've become part of something larger." He hadn't understood it then, but he did now. Healing, living, dying, it was all motion. The body, the heart, the spirit, they were rivers, not monuments. He smiled as a cool breeze brushed past, carrying the faint scent of lotus flowers. "You've aged well, old friend," he said to the river, as if it were listening. Still flowing, still forgiving. The water lapped softly at the shore, as if answering him. He knew that when his time came, his ashes would join that current, carried toward the sea, mingling with every healer, every patient, every story that ever lived. It comforted him to think that nothing was truly lost, just transformed. And as the stars deepened above and the moon slipped lower in the sky, he leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the sounds of the night wash over him. Somewhere far off, a flute played. Somewhere closer, a child laughed. Life was still busy with its small, stubborn miracles. He couldn't help but grin. "The gods," he whispered. "They must be tired of watching us fumble and still find joy." Then, with a sigh that sounded almost like a prayer, he let the rhythm of the river cradle him, a man who had spent his whole life mending others, now finally healed by the gentle hands of the world itself. The dawn crept slowly across the horizon, its first light turning the Nile into a ribbon of gold. The healer's house, small and humble, stood like an old memory against the desert's endless stretch. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs and warm oil. A pot simmered quietly in the corner, releasing a faint trail of steam that curled like a spirit rising. He moved carefully around the room, slower now than in his younger days, but with the same steady rhythm that had guided his hands through countless lives. Age had not dulled his purpose, only refined it. There was a kind of elegance in slowness, he thought. The world rushed, but healing never did. He poured the mixture into a clay bowl, the liquid shimmering dark and fragrant. Once this would have been for a patient, but now it was just for himself, a tonic for the joints, or perhaps an excuse to keep practicing. His fingers, though frail, still knew the language of care. They remembered every motion like a song that could never quite be forgotten. He smiled at the absurdity of it. The healer treating himself, trying to patch together the same body that time was gently dismantling. "I suppose," he muttered to the empty room, "we all end up our own experiment in the end." A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. A boy stood at the door, no older than 10, clutching a small bird with a broken wing. The healer beckoned him in, gesturing to place the bird on the table. Its wing trembled, feathers matted with dirt and fear. The boy's eyes were wide, the kind of innocence that still believed anything could be fixed. The healer worked silently, binding the wing with a strip of linen, humming under his breath. When he finished, he handed the bird back carefully. "Keep it warm," he said. "And patient." The boy frowned. "Will it fly again?" The healer smiled. "Everything that's meant to move eventually does." It wasn't just advice for the bird. When the boy left, the room felt quieter, but somehow fuller. It reminded him of something his master once told him. Healing isn't about mending the broken. It's about teaching the broken how to live differently. At the time, he'd thought it a poetic exaggeration. Now he knew it was truth. Life didn't always return what was lost, but it offered something else in its place. A new balance, a new strength, a new story. He often wondered if that was what the gods intended all along. Not perfection, but adaptation. After all, even the Nile changed course when the earth shifted, and no one called it a failure. He sat by the window, the sun warming his face, and listened to the world wake up. The distant calls of merchants, the laughter of children, the splash of oars in the river. It was the same music he'd known since boyhood. Yet now it sounded richer, like a song he'd finally learned the meaning of. He thought about how strange it was that the closer one got to the end, the more alive everything seemed. The smell of bread, the texture of clay, even the hum of a fly, it all shimmered with importance. Perhaps, he mused, the secret to immortality wasn't in escaping death, but in noticing life before it's too late. He reached for a papyrus scroll beside him, one of many he'd written over the years. They weren't manuals or records. They were reflections, little fragments of thought he wanted to leave behind. His handwriting was uneven now, letters bending like tired reeds, but the words still carried weight. He read one aloud. "Healing is the art of listening to what pain refuses to say." He chuckled softly. Not bad for a man who used to faint at the sight of blood. He remembered that first day vividly, the panic, the trembling hands, the realization that courage wasn't about not fearing pain, but about facing it anyway. If youth was about learning how to heal others, old age was about learning how to heal yourself. Outside, a breeze passed through the palm trees, carrying the laughter of a group of women washing clothes by the river. Their laughter was sharp, real, the kind that reminded him how humor had always been medicine too. He remembered once treating a nobleman who insisted his headache was caused by a curse. The healer had nodded seriously and said, "Ah, yes, the rare curse of overthinking." The man hadn't laughed, but his wife nearly fell off her chair. Ironically, the headache disappeared by the next morning. Maybe curses weren't as powerful as embarrassment. He leaned back and thought about all the times laughter had saved more people than medicine ever could. In a land where gods decided everything, from harvests to health, laughter was rebellion. It reminded people that they were still human, still free, still capable of joy even when fate was unkind. He'd learned to use humor the way some used herbs, sparingly but with precision. "If I can make you smile," he once told a dying man, "then you're already half healed." It wasn't entirely a joke. Hope had a strange way of turning biology into poetry. The healer wasn't one for temples or rituals. He believed the sacred lived in simpler places, in the way someone poured water, in the pause before a confession, in the stillness between heartbeats. The gods, he liked to say, don't hide in the heavens, they hide in the moments you're too busy to notice. His apprentices had found that both comforting and frustrating. They wanted grand wisdom, not riddles. But the older he grew, the more he realized that riddles were the truest form of truth, open-ended, alive, refusing to sit quietly on a shelf. Sometimes he wondered what kind of mark he'd leave on the world. The pyramids would outlast him, the pharaohs' names would be carved in stone, and his would fade into dust. But maybe that was all right. He wasn't meant to be remembered by name, but by influence, like the scent of herbs long after the fire burns out. Perhaps some future healer, somewhere, would read his words or recall his methods without knowing their source. That, he thought, was the purest kind of immortality, the kind that required no monument, only memory. As the light shifted and shadows lengthened, he stood slowly, his joints protesting with familiar defiance. He walked outside, the air warm and thick, the world bathed in the amber glow of late afternoon. The boy from earlier ran past him, the bird still cradled gently in his hands. "It's eating!" the boy shouted, his face glowing with triumph. The healer grinned. "Then it's already healing." The boy nodded, then dashed away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and laughter. The healer watched him go, his heart swelling with quiet satisfaction. He turned his gaze back toward the horizon, where the sun melted into the desert's edge. The colors shifted like a painting made by the gods themselves, deep gold fading into crimson, then into the cool blue of approaching night. Somewhere, a heron took flight, its silhouette gliding effortlessly against the sky. The healer followed it with his eyes until it vanished into distance. He smiled. "Everything that's meant to move eventually does," he whispered again, this time to himself. And as darkness began to settle, he returned inside, the last rays of light catching on the jars and scrolls that lined his shelves. He felt no fear of what was coming, only gratitude for what had been. The river outside whispered softly, the eternal song of movement and memory. He closed his eyes, breathing it in, knowing that when he was gone, the current would carry him too, not as a body, but as part of the same endless rhythm he'd spent his life honoring. The healer smiled one final time, not in farewell, but in recognition, because he finally understood that the greatest act of healing was never about the body, but about learning how to let the world keep flowing through you, even after you're gone. The morning began with a silence so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. The first rays of sunlight crept through the narrow cracks in the healer's window, painting thin golden lines across the floor. Dust floated lazily in the air, glowing like tiny galaxies suspended in time. He sat quietly, staring at them, marveling at how even the smallest particles of life found a way to dance. "The gods," he muttered to himself with a smirk, "must have been in a playful mood when they made dust and men, both impossible to get rid of, and both constantly getting in the way." He had slept little, but that was nothing new. Sleep had become a visitor that came only when invited with patience, and he had long stopped trying to impress it. Instead, he spent his dawns reflecting, as if each sunrise were a private appointment with his own soul. The air carried a faint chill, and with it the scent of old parchment, herbs, and the faint sweetness of lotus oil. It was a familiar fragrance, the perfume of years spent in devotion to something larger than himself, something he still couldn't quite name. Healing, he thought, was never just about the body. It was about faith, not necessarily in gods, but in the simple, stubborn belief that life was worth mending. Outside, the village had already begun to stir. He could hear the rhythmic pounding of grain, the distant bleating of goats, and the laughter of children too young to worry about tomorrow. That sound never failed to make him smile. He once told his apprentices that children were the best proof that the world still had hope. "They fall, they cry, they stand, and then they forget," he'd said. "If only adults could remember how to forget, we'd save ourselves a great deal of misery." It was one of those truths that seemed humorous until it wasn't. Memory, after all, was both blessing and curse, the reason people learned and the reason they suffered. He rose slowly from his chair, joints protesting with the familiar ache of experience. Every step reminded him that he was no longer the man who had once walked from village to village under the desert sun, carrying medicine and stories in equal measure. Now, people came to him, not just for cures, but for conversation. Somewhere along the way, he had become less of a doctor and more of a confessor. He didn't mind. Sometimes words healed faster than herbs. There were people whose bodies were fine, but whose souls were sick from secrets. Those were the hardest to treat. You couldn't bandage guilt, and you couldn't set a broken heart with splints. You could only listen and hope the silence between words did the rest. That morning, a familiar face appeared at his door. An old friend named Khepri, a potter whose hands had molded clay long before the healer ever mixed herbs. They had grown old together, each crafting his own form of creation. "I came to bring you this," Khepri said, holding up a small clay jar. "For your tea or for your ashes, whichever comes first." The healer laughed, clutching his stomach. "You always bring comfort and insults in the same package." Khepri grinned. "Well, I figured if I can't keep you alive, I can at least make sure you leave in style." Their laughter filled the room, easy and genuine, the kind of laughter that only old men could share, born not from humor, but from the relief of still being here. They sat for hours, drinking tea and talking about nothing and everything. The price of grain, the foolishness of priests, the unpredictable moods of the Nile. It was strange how, with age, the conversations that once felt small became the most sacred. There was a peace in simplicity, in speaking of things that asked for no solutions. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" Khepri asked suddenly, his voice softer. The healer leaned back, eyes on the ceiling. "Every day," he said, "but I've stopped expecting answers. Maybe that's the trick to wisdom, asking the same questions with less desperation." Khepri nodded. "And what if the gods are just as confused as we are?" The healer chuckled. "Then at least I won't be alone." After his friend left, the healer walked to the edge of his garden where the first blossoms of the season were pushing through the soil. The earth, dark and moist, smelled of promise. He knelt down slowly, pressing his hand to the ground. It pulsed faintly with warmth, the heartbeat of something eternal. He thought of all the lives he had touched, those who lived because of him and those who hadn't. He no longer saw success or failure in them. Each story had its own place in the vast tapestry of existence. Healing, he realized, was not about control. It was about participation. You joined life's conversation for as long as you could, and when it was your time, you let others continue it. He remembered a woman once, years ago, who had come to him with a child on the brink of death. The fever had burned for days, and every remedy failed. The woman wept, cursing the gods, cursing him. He stayed with her through the night, holding the boy's small hand, whispering stories as if the sound of his voice could anchor him to the world. The boy didn't survive, but in the morning, as the mother slept exhausted beside him, he realized something. His job had not been to save the child. It had been to keep love alive in that room long enough for grief to find its dignity. That lesson stayed with him longer than any cure. He had grown more philosophical since then, though not in the grand, pompous way of temple scribes who thought too much and lived too little. His philosophy was practical, like his medicine. "We're all just temporary caretakers," he liked to say, "of our bodies, our homes, our stories. Even our joys don't belong to us forever. They're just visiting." People often laughed at that, until they realized it was true. Ownership, he believed, was the biggest illusion humans had ever invented. The gods probably watched them clinging to their possessions with the same amusement one feels watching a child trying to catch sunlight in a jar. As dusk began to fall, he lit a small lamp and sat by the window, watching the sky turn the color of ripe figs. The air was still, heavy with the scent of jasmine. He thought about the young healers who would come after him, how they would mix herbs with trembling hands, certain they could fix the world. He hoped they would learn, as he had, that healing was never about fixing. It was about accompanying, about being present in the space between pain and peace. "If you do it right," he whispered to the quiet room, "you won't just heal others, you'll let them heal you too." The night deepened and the stars began their slow dance over the river. He lay down on his mat, the same one he had used for decades. His breath was slow, his heart steady. He could hear the faint hum of the Nile outside, eternal and forgiving. He smiled at the thought that one day he would join it, not as a healer or a man, but as part of the current, another ripple in the endless rhythm of life. Before sleep took him, he laughed softly to himself. "The gods really do have a sense of humor," he said. "They made us fragile just so we'd learn how strong love can be." And as his eyes closed, the world around him exhaled, the lamp flickered once, and the river outside continued to flow, carrying his laughter, his lessons, and his life into the infinite tide of everything that ever was, and everything that would ever be. The wind rose from the west that morning, slow and heavy, carrying with it the faint scent of the river. The healer sat on the threshold of his home, eyes half closed, listening to the sounds of a world that seemed in no rush to begin. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crowed late, as if it too had grown weary of punctuality. He smiled to himself, amused by the laziness of life. There was a beauty in things taking their time. After all, wasn't healing itself just another way of saying patience wearing a white robe? He watched the sunlight stretch its golden fingers across the sand, touching the walls of his garden, the jars of herbs lined neatly on a low shelf, the bowl of figs waiting for breakfast. Each object had its place. Each carried a story. The pestle had belonged to his master. The linen cloth, frayed and yellowed, had once wrapped the wounds of a soldier who later named his first child after him. The small wooden chair by the window, he had carved it himself in a fit of youthful pride, though one of the legs was shorter than the others. It wobbled slightly, but he refused to fix it. Imperfection, he liked to say, is just personality in disguise. It struck him how much of life was made up of such tiny, ordinary things. The world liked to glorify great deeds, wars, inventions, kings. But in truth, history was built on the quiet consistency of people who simply showed up. The woman who baked bread every morning, the man who mended sandals, the child who fetched water without complaint. They were the true architects of endurance. He wondered if the gods laughed at humanity's obsession with monuments, while the real miracles happened in kitchens and gardens. Maybe that was their secret joke, that eternity was hidden in the small things. A soft rustle pulled his attention toward the door. A young woman stood there, clutching her shawl tightly. Her face was pale, her eyes red from weeping. "He's not breathing," she whispered. He didn't ask who. He simply nodded, grabbed his satchel, and followed her through the narrow streets, his bare feet kicking up small clouds of dust. The air was thick with heat and incense. A funeral had passed not long before, the scent of myrrh still lingering in the air like sorrow that refused to leave. They reached a small house, dimly lit and filled with silence that had weight. On a mat near the wall lay a man, motionless. The healer knelt beside him, placing 2 fingers on the man's neck, feeling nothing but the chill of absence. The woman stood trembling behind him, her hands pressed together as if in prayer. He turned slowly, meeting her eyes. "Sometimes," he said gently, "we come too late for the body, but never too late for the soul." She began to cry again, and he let her. There were moments when the only medicine left was permission to grieve. He stayed with her until the sun dipped low, helping prepare the man's body for burial. It was a ritual as old as breath, washing, wrapping, whispering farewells. Death, he often thought, was not the opposite of healing, but its final stage, the moment when the body's struggles were released back into the universe. He didn't fear it anymore. Death was like the Nile. It took what it must, but it always gave something back. Perhaps not to those who remained, but to the world itself. After she thanked him and left, he walked to the riverbank. The sky had turned a deep shade of indigo, the stars beginning their quiet procession. He crouched down, scooping water into his hands, watching it slip through his fingers. Everything, he realized, was like that. Love, laughter, time. You could never hold it for long, but maybe you weren't meant to. The point wasn't to possess, but to participate. The river didn't mourn what it lost. It just kept moving. He envied it for that. He sat there for a long time, tracing circles in the sand with a stick. The air grew colder, and the frogs began their nighttime chorus. He thought of all the people he had treated over the years, their faces flickering through his memory like candlelight. Some had lived, some hadn't. Some had thanked him, others had cursed him. Yet all of them, in their own way, had taught him something about what it meant to be human. He had learned that suffering was not a flaw in existence, but a part of its design, a reminder that connection was not optional. Pain was the thread that wove people together, the proof that we needed each other. He laughed softly, startling a nearby bird. "Imagine," he said aloud, "a world without pain. No reason to comfort, no reason to care. We'd all just float around healthy and heartless." He shook his head. "No, the gods knew what they were doing. They gave us pain so we'd remember to touch." The next morning, he woke to the sound of footsteps outside. One of his apprentices, a young man named Rami, stood at the door holding a clay tablet covered in notes. "Master," he said breathlessly, "I think I've discovered something new. A mixture that stops bleeding faster than anything we've tried." The healer smiled, motioning for him to sit. He examined the tablet, nodding approvingly. "Very good," he said. "But tell me, did you thank the herbs?" Rami blinked, confused. "Thank them?" The healer chuckled. "Yes, the plants. They gave up their lives for your discovery. It's only polite." Rami laughed, thinking it a joke, but the healer was half serious. He had long believed that gratitude was the secret ingredient in every cure. "People think medicine comes from the hands," he said once, "but it really comes from the heart. The herbs, the minerals, they respond to intention. You can't heal something you secretly resent." The idea seemed strange to many, but he'd seen enough to know it was true. Patients treated with care healed faster. Kindness, it turned out, was not just good manners, it was chemistry. Later that day, as the sun reached its highest point, he watched Rami mixing herbs in the courtyard, his brow furrowed with concentration. The healer smiled at the sight. He remembered himself at that age, impatient, driven by the illusion that knowledge was control. He wanted to tell the boy that control was a mirage, that mastery came not from domination, but from surrender. But he held his tongue. Some lessons couldn't be taught, they had to be lived. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the desert met the sky in a haze of shimmering light. Everything seemed to hum with quiet understanding. The wind, the water, even the insects in the reeds. Life was not a battle to be won. It was a dialogue to be joined. The healer felt a wave of peace wash over him, so profound it almost made him laugh. Perhaps, he thought, that's what healing really is. Not the end of pain, but the beginning of understanding. As the day faded and the stars returned, he found himself standing by the river once more. The current murmured softly, like an old friend repeating a secret he'd already heard. He closed his eyes, feeling the night settle around him, the cool air pressing gently against his skin. Somewhere in the distance, a jackal howled, and he smiled. The world was still wild, still unpredictable, still perfect in its imperfection. He thought about how tomorrow he would teach Rami how to read the pulse properly, how to sense not just the heartbeat, but the emotion behind it. But for now, he simply stood there, breathing, alive in the quiet wonder of existence. The river whispered again, and this time he whispered back. And in that moment he understood something he had spent a lifetime chasing. That healing had never been about saving life from death, but about honoring the space in between. That sacred pause where the body waits, the heart listens, and the soul remembers it is part of everything. He laughed softly once more, not out of joy or sorrow, but out of gratitude for the absurd, miraculous rhythm of it all, and for the chance, however brief, to have been its witness. The night had been long and full of whispers. The healer lay awake on his mat, eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling as if they formed constellations of memory. Sleep refused to visit him, but he didn't mind. Some nights were not meant for rest, they were meant for remembering. Outside, the river murmured softly, a sound that had followed him through every season of his life. He thought of it as a companion, loyal and untiring, forever flowing, even when everything else stood still. It made him wonder whether time itself might be more like water, something that doesn't pass, but simply carries us along. He rose before dawn, his joints creaking in protest. The air was cool, sweet with the smell of wet earth. The stars were fading, though one or two lingered, stubborn as old men refusing to leave a conversation. He stepped outside and watched the sky bleed from indigo to gold, the first light sliding across the horizon. It always amazed him how the sun could rise the same way every day and still manage to feel like a miracle. He once told his apprentices, "You'll never understand life until you've watched the sunrise after a night you thought you wouldn't survive." They'd laughed nervously then, thinking it a poetic exaggeration. Only time would teach them he meant it literally. He prepared his morning tea, pouring hot water over crushed mint leaves, and inhaled the steam with closed eyes. Each sip grounded him, pulling him gently from memory into the present. The taste was sharp but comforting, like truth. He smiled faintly. The human heart, he mused, wasn't so different from this, always steeping in something, extracting its flavor from pain, love, or longing. The secret was to keep it from boiling over. Most people never learned that. They mistook intensity for depth, forgetting that even boiling water eventually evaporates. The day began quietly until a man came rushing into the courtyard, his tunic torn, his breath ragged. "Master," he cried, "my wife is in labor. The pain won't stop." The healer didn't hesitate. He gathered his tools, wrapped a clean cloth over his shoulder, and followed. The man led him through narrow alleys that smelled of life, fish, sweat, smoke, and bread. The healer always found comfort in those smells. They were proof that chaos was just another form of order. When they reached the small house, the air was thick with fear and incense. The woman lay on a low bed, gripping the sheets, her cries echoing off the clay walls. The healer moved quickly, his hand steady, his voice calm. He whispered soft instructions, part prayer, part reassurance. He had seen the scene countless times, but each one felt new, because every birth was both an ending and a beginning. Hours passed, time dissolving into the rhythm of breath and heartbeat. Finally, a sound pierced the tension, a cry, thin but strong. The healer smiled. "A boy," he said, wrapping the newborn gently. "You see, even the gods still believe in us." The man wept, kissing his wife's forehead. The healer stayed only long enough to ensure all was well, then quietly slipped away. He had learned that joy was sacred, and sometimes the best thing one could do was not linger in it too long. On his way back, he passed a group of children chasing a stray goat through the street. Their laughter rang out like bells, wild and uncontrollable. He stopped to watch, his face lighting up. "Ah," he said aloud, "there's medicine in that sound if only people knew how to take it." He chuckled at his own thought, "But no one would pay for laughter. It's too cheap, too abundant. People only value what they can lose." As he walked, he thought about how strange it was that humanity had learned to build pyramids, chart the stars, and preserve the dead, yet still hadn't mastered the art of peace. People wanted everything to last forever: power, youth, even sorrow. They treated permanence as the highest virtue, when in truth, impermanence was the only reason life mattered at all. A flower that never wilted would stop being beautiful. A heart that never broke would never grow. It was the fragility of things that made them worth loving. He laughed softly. "The gods really are clever," he murmured. "They made us fragile enough to care and foolish enough to think it's a flaw." When he returned home, his apprentice Rami was waiting, his face smeared with soot. "Master," he said, panicked. "I was boiling resin, and it caught fire." The healer raised an eyebrow. "Did the resin learn to fly?" Rami looked confused. "No, it burned." The healer nodded gravely. "Then it did exactly what fire does when you stop watching it." He sighed and walked into the workshop. The air smelled faintly of smoke and stubbornness. "You can't rush nature," he said, inspecting the charred pot. "If you want to work with the elements, you must make them your friends. Otherwise, they'll remind you who's in charge." Rami lowered his head. "I just wanted to be as good as you." The healer smiled, setting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Goodness isn't something you chase. It's something that grows when you stop trying to impress it." He poured fresh water into a clean pot and motioned for Rami to start again. "Patience," he said. "That's the difference between a healer and a magician. Magicians want miracles. Healers settle for truth." The afternoon passed in quiet labor. Outside, the air shimmered with heat, cicadas singing their endless song. The healer felt an ache in his bones, the kind that spoke not of illness, but of years. He didn't fight it anymore. Pain, he'd learned, was just the body's way of saying, I still remember being alive. He thought of how many people spent their lives trying to avoid it, numbing themselves with distractions, chasing pleasures that left them emptier than before. If pain taught in schools, he thought wryly, the world would have fewer fools and fewer philosophers, but a lot more honest people. As dusk fell, he stepped outside again. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of rose and copper. The river shimmered in response as if applauding the day's performance. He found himself laughing at the thought that maybe the world wasn't so different from a play. The gods, the audience, humans the actors, and death the curtain call that always came too soon. The trick, he decided, was not to fear the ending, but to make sure your part was worth remembering. He sat on the riverbank, tracing the shape of the horizon with his eyes. He had once believed wisdom was about knowing more than others. Now he understood it was about needing less. He had fewer possessions, fewer ambitions, fewer answers, but somehow he felt fuller. The universe, it seemed, was not interested in what you could take from it, but in what you could leave behind without regret. He smiled, watching the reflection of the stars ripple in the water. Maybe that's the final cure, he whispered. Learning how to let go without fear. The wind rose again, gentle and warm, brushing against his face like an old friend's hand. The sounds of the night returned. The frogs, the water, the soft hum of life itself, continuing as it always had. He closed his eyes, listening, and for a moment he could swear the river was speaking back to him. Not in words, but in something older, deeper, an understanding that everything he'd ever done, every life he'd touched, every laugh he'd shared, had already joined the current. He wasn't leaving anything behind. He was already part of the flow. And as the stars multiplied above him and the moon rose pale and patient over the water, the healer smiled one last time, not because he had found all the answers, but because he had finally stopped needing them. The world, in all its chaos and tenderness, had always been enough. The night before the flood, the air had a strange stillness to it. The healer could feel it long before the river began to swell, an unease that clung to the wind, thick and expectant. The villagers went about their work as usual, pretending not to notice, as if ignoring the signs might keep disaster away. But the healer had lived long enough to know that nature never asked for permission to remind humans who was in charge. He looked up at the bruised sky, sighed, and muttered, "Well, here comes another lecture from the gods." He said it half in jest, half in resignation, and as always, no god cared to reply. He spent the afternoon moving his jars of herbs onto higher shelves, not because he believed it would save them, but because doing something always felt better than doing nothing. It was a human thing, this desperate choreography of control in the face of chaos. When you can't change the storm, he once told his apprentice, at least look busy enough that it thinks you're cooperating. It was his own kind of humor, dry but honest. The apprentice had laughed, though he'd probably thought it was just another one of his master's eccentric sayings. The rain began at dusk, softly at first, like hesitant applause. By nightfall, it was a roar. The healer sat near the window, watching the heavens pour themselves onto the earth. Water streamed from the rooftops, pooled in the streets, and swallowed the moonlight whole. The sound was deafening, yet somehow comforting. Rain had a rhythm that made him feel less alone, like the world itself was breathing with him. He leaned back, wrapped in his shawl, and let his thoughts drift. How many floods had there been? How many times had humanity rebuilt, only to forget again the fragility of its foundations? People had short memories when it came to humility. He smiled faintly at the thought. We call it civilization, he murmured. But it's really just nature's favorite hobby, seeing how many times she can knock us down before we stop pretending we're taller than her. He laughed quietly, shaking his head. The gods must love irony. They gave humans intelligence just to watch them use it to build homes in flood zones. By morning, the storm had eased, but the damage was done. The river had swallowed the lower part of the village, leaving behind a trail of mud, broken pottery, and stunned silence. People wandered through the wreckage, dazed but determined. The healer moved among them slowly, offering words of comfort and herbs for wounds. He marveled, not for the first time, at the human ability to endure. You see, he told one of the villagers, even the mud is honest. It never pretends to be something it's not. The man blinked, unsure whether that was supposed to make him feel better. The healer smiled. You'll laugh at it later, he said. That's how healing works. They spent the next few days rebuilding what could be saved. The healer's small house had survived, though some of his scrolls were soaked through. He spread them out in the sun, trying to salvage what he could. The ink had bled, turning words into smudged poetry. He traced one with his finger, recognizing a fragment of his own handwriting. To heal is not to fix, but to accompany. He chuckled softly. Even blurred, the truth remained. Maybe that was the point. Knowledge didn't need to be clear to be true. A few days later, a boy approached him carrying a small clay jar he had found floating near the riverbank. Inside it, there was a faint shimmer, an oil mixture the healer had lost years ago. It smells funny, the boy said, wrinkling his nose. The healer took it, uncorked it, and inhaled deeply. The scent was sharp, earthy, familiar. Funny? he said, grinning. That's the smell of wisdom. Most people can't stand it. The boy laughed, and the healer handed him a fig. Keep it, he said. The gods like it when we trade old things for sweet ones. That night, as the village gathered to share food and stories, the healer sat by the fire, listening more than speaking. The air buzzed with the sound of survival, laughter, plans, and the occasional argument over who had stolen whose basket. It reminded him that even in loss, humans found a way to make noise, as if silence itself were something too dangerous to bear. He thought about how often people sought peace but panicked when they actually found it. We say we want quiet, he whispered to himself. But the truth is, most of us are afraid of hearing what it has to say. A woman sitting nearby overheard and smiled. You always speak like a poet, healer, she said. Is that what keeps you from growing old? He laughed. No, he replied. I grow old like everyone else. I just do it with better dialogue. Her laughter joined his, and for a moment the years seemed to dissolve into the warmth of the firelight. Later, when most of the villagers had gone to sleep, he stayed behind, staring at the embers. They glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Fire, he thought, was an honest teacher. It gave warmth, but only if you respected its hunger. That balance, the dance between creation and destruction, was the same in everything. Even love required burning something away to make room for what could grow. Maybe that was why he never married. He'd spent his life tending to other people's flames and forgotten to feed his own. He wasn't bitter about it, though. Some lives were meant to be kindling for others. The stars returned that night, bright and unashamed after their absence. He watched them for a long time, remembering the nights of his youth when he'd slept under open skies, chasing the illusion that understanding the heavens might help him understand himself. He smiled at the memory of that young fool with his wide eyes and empty stomach, walking miles to treat a stranger with little more than hope and a bag of dried herbs. That boy had wanted to change the world. The man he had become simply wanted to honor it. He lay back on the ground, his head resting on folded arms. The world was quieter now. The air smelled of damp earth and renewal. He thought about how everything in life followed the same pattern: build, lose, rebuild. It was exhausting, but it was also beautiful. Humans didn't endure because they were strong. They endured because they were stubborn enough to love again after loss. Maybe, he thought, that's what immortality really is, our refusal to stop beginning. He laughed softly at the thought, his breath forming tiny clouds in the cool air. Somewhere nearby, an owl hooted, and he raised his hand in mock salute. Yes, yes, he said. I hear you. The night always wins. But he didn't say it with fear. There was a strange comfort in surrender, in knowing that the darkness was not an enemy, but a reminder of light's persistence. As the last embers of the fire faded, he closed his eyes, not in weariness, but in gratitude. The river would rise again someday. The winds would return, and the world would break in new and creative ways. But for now, everything was exactly as it should be, fragile, fleeting, and magnificent. He smiled, the same quiet smile he had worn all his life, and whispered to the night, Let it come. I've learned how to listen. And somewhere beyond the veil of sleep, where dreams dissolve into memory, the healer's laughter drifted softly into the current of the river, merging with the eternal hum of existence, proof that, even after everything, life would always find a way to begin again. The sun was already high when he woke, spilling light through the window like molten gold. The healer stretched slowly, feeling the familiar ache in his joints, the soft protest of a body that had carried too many years and too many stories. He didn't rush to rise. He had long stopped measuring his worth by his speed. The young ran because they feared running out of time. The old moved carefully because they knew time wasn't something to chase. It was something to dance with, step by patient step. He sat up and reached for the cup of water by his bedside. It was lukewarm, but it tasted of life, simple and clean. Every sip felt like a quiet ceremony, a small rebellion against the indifference of age. He smiled faintly. Still breathing, he whispered to himself, and still complaining. That must mean the gods haven't finished laughing at me yet. It wasn't a complaint. It was his way of honoring the absurd contract between mortality and meaning. Outside, the world was already alive. The hum of merchants, the bray of donkeys, the laughter of children echoing through the streets, all the ordinary sounds that made existence extraordinary. He walked to the doorway and stood there for a while, letting the air brush his face. It smelled of bread, dust, and the faint perfume of river reeds. It was a scent he had known since childhood, and yet it still had the power to stir something inside him. Familiarity, he thought, was just memory pretending to be the present. He watched a group of young men carrying baskets of grain toward the market. Their shoulders were strong, their laughter loud, their movements impatient. He saw himself in them, not in their strength, but in their certainty. Youth always believed it was building permanence, never realizing it was merely sculpting sandcastles between tides. Ah, he murmured, to be foolish again? What a blessing. But wisdom had its own sweetness, one that took years to ripen. It was the kind of sweetness that lingered after everything else had faded, like the faint taste of honey at the bottom of an empty jar. A knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Rami, his apprentice, carrying a small wooden box. Master, he said breathlessly. I found something in the old storage room. Inside the box were 3 vials, the glass clouded with age, and a small note written in the healer's own hand decades ago. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible, for when the cure must come from memory. He stared at it for a long time, trying to recall when or why he had written it. Rami looked puzzled. "What does it mean?" he asked. The healer smiled. "It means," he said slowly, "that sometimes the remedy is not in the jar, but in the story behind it." He remembered now, the vials were part of an experiment he had abandoned long ago, a failed attempt to distill emotion into medicine. He had believed, in his arrogance, that if fear could make people sick, then courage could make them well. He laughed softly at the memory. "I was young," he said, shaking his head. "Too much heart, not enough humility." But the idea wasn't wrong, he realized. It had just taken him a lifetime to understand that emotions were medicine, just not in the way he had imagined. A kind word could lower fever. A shared laugh could ease pain. The body and the soul were not separate. They were 2 voices in the same song. Rami listened intently, his eyes wide. "So, healing comes from stories?" The healer nodded. "From stories, from touch, from silence. Every cure begins with attention. Most people don't die because they're sick. They die because they're unseen." He could tell the boy didn't fully grasp it yet, but he didn't need him to. Understanding came not through explanation, but through living. "You'll learn," he said gently. "One day, when your hands tremble for the right reasons." As the day wore on, he found himself wandering through the village. The flood had receded, leaving behind both ruin and renewal. Children played in puddles that sparkled like bits of stolen sky. The marketplace buzzed again, louder and brighter than before. He marveled at how quickly life returned to itself. It was as if the world refused to acknowledge its own fragility. Maybe that was the secret of survival. Not strength, but forgetfulness. The ability to start again without asking why. He stopped at a stall where an old potter was shaping clay. The man's hands moved with slow confidence, pressing, turning, coaxing the formless into form. The healer watched for a long time, entranced by the rhythm. "Do you ever grow tired of making the same shapes?" he asked. The potter smiled without looking up. "Never the same," he said. "The clay remembers differently each time." The healer nodded, understanding more than the words themselves. Every life, every body, every wound, each carried its own memory. Healing wasn't about erasing that memory, but teaching it how to sing in tune again. He continued walking, his thoughts weaving themselves into quiet reflections. Everywhere he looked, he saw small miracles disguised as routine. The baker pulling golden loaves from the oven, the mother untangling her child's hair, the fisherman mending his net with the patience of someone who knew tomorrow depended on today's threads. Life, he realized, didn't need grand gestures to be divine. The sacred hid best in simplicity. When evening came, he sat by the river, as he always did, watching the light dance on the water. The current was slow, but unstoppable, like time itself. He thought of all the faces that had passed through his hands, the sick, the dying, the newly born. Each one had left an imprint, like ripples that never fully disappeared. He wondered if his own face would one day be remembered in the same way. Probably not. But that didn't trouble him. Legacy, he decided, wasn't about being remembered. It was about leaving the world slightly more bearable than you found it. He leaned back, feeling the warmth of the earth beneath him. A memory surfaced. His first teacher, a stern woman with eyes like flint, telling him, "Healing is the art of staying curious about what hurts." He hadn't understood it then. Now he smiled at the brilliance of its simplicity. Curiosity was compassion disguised as wonder. It was the reason he had never truly stopped learning, even as his hands grew weak. The first stars began to appear, shy and shimmering. He reached for a small flask of wine, took a sip, and laughed softly. "To the gods," he said, raising it toward the sky, "and to their sense of humor, for giving us wisdom only when we're too old to show off with it." He imagined them laughing back, amused by his audacity. Perhaps they didn't punish humans at all. Perhaps they simply tested how long they could keep laughing in the face of uncertainty. As darkness deepened, he lay down by the riverbank, his thoughts slowing to match the rhythm of the water. The moon rose pale and full, casting its reflection like a second world beneath the surface. He thought about how everything, light, shadow, reflection, depended on perspective. Maybe that was the ultimate lesson. Nothing was ever as solid as it seemed. Not truth, not sorrow, not even life itself. The universe, he mused, was a dance of illusions, and meaning was simply how gracefully one moved through them. He felt his eyes grow heavy, the hum of the night wrapping around him like a soft blanket. He wasn't afraid. Death, he realized, was not an interruption, but an interlude, a pause between breaths, between stories. The river would carry him, as it carried everything, into whatever came next. And maybe, somewhere along that endless current, someone would tell his story. Not as legend, not as lesson, but as a whisper about a man who listened to pain until it turned into peace. He smiled, the kind of smile that held both gratitude and surrender. The stars shimmered brighter. The river sang its quiet hymn, and the healer closed his eyes, finally understanding that the end was just another kind of beginning, one he had been preparing for all his life. one that, like every true act of healing, asked only for trust.